17-year-old Kayla Morgan sat in that Ohio courtroom like she owned it, cuffs clinking softly against the wooden table as the judge read the words, "First-degree murder." She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Instead, she laughed, a cold, mocking sound that made every heart in that room freeze. The victim's mother gripped her tissue so tightly, her knuckles turned white, while Kayla rolled her eyes and mouthed the word "whatever" to the cameras. She thought her age would protect her. She thought no one could touch her. But then the prosecutor stood and called a name that made Kayla's smirk finally crack. The state calls Lena Morgan, her own sister. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. This is how it all began. Just weeks earlier, our Riverside, Ohio, was the kind of quiet town where school buses lined up beside maple trees and honor roll banners hung from chain-link fences. Emily Santos, 16 years old, walked those halls with a backpack full of textbooks and dreams of studying biomedical engineering. Teachers called her the girl who stayed late to stack chairs, the one who tutored classmates even when it cost her sleep. She was paired with Kayla Morgan for an English project about revenge in classic literature. Emily thought it would be fine. She texted a friend the night before, saying Kayla seemed intense but probably just edgy. That was the last normal night of her life. The next afternoon, Emily left school with Kayla, walking toward a wooded shortcut most students avoided after dark. By 7 that evening, Emily's mother was calling 911, her voice shaking as she said, "My daughter never does this. Something's wrong." The fluorescent lights in the Riverside County Courthouse hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow across the packed courtroom where 17-year-old Kayla Morgan sat with her spine pressed against the wooden chair, ankles shackled beneath the defense table. Her orange detention jumpsuit had been covered with a borrowed blazer meant to soften her appearance, but nothing could disguise the expression on her face, a crooked smirk that twisted at the corners of her mouth as Judge Marjorie Keene's voice filled the room with words like premeditated and first-degree murder. The contrast was jarring in a way that made people uncomfortable. This teenage girl who could have been sitting in any algebra class or lunch line now facing the possibility of spending most of her life behind bars, and somehow, impossibly, she looked amused. The judge paused mid-sentence, her reading glasses slipping slightly down her nose as she glanced up from the document in her hands. Kayla had made a sound, a low chuckle that bubbled up from her throat and escaped before her attorney could elbow her into silence. She shook her head slowly, like she was watching a comedy show where the punchline had landed all wrong, and that small gesture of dismissal rippled through the gallery like a shockwave. Emily Santos's mother, Anna, sat in the front row, gripping a crumpled tissue so tightly her knuckles had turned bone white, her body rigid with the kind of grief that doesn't know how to sit still. When Kayla laughed, Anna's breath caught audibly, and the woman beside her had to grip her shoulder to keep her from standing up and screaming. The courtroom had been filled to capacity since early morning, with local residents who'd followed every development of the case, classmates of both girls who couldn't believe what had happened, and reporters whose cameras lined the back wall like a firing squad of lenses. Everyone had seen the evidence presented over the previous days, the recovered text messages, the blood-stained hoodie, the fingerprint that placed Kayla's hand on the victim's shattered phone. But nothing had prepared them for this moment, for the sight of a teenage killer treating her own murder trial like an inconvenience she'd been forced to attend. Judge Keene set down her papers with deliberate care, her jaw tightening in a way that made the veteran court officers exchange knowing glances. "This is not funny, Ms. Morgan," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs with the precision of a scalpel. Kayla's response was to roll her eyes in a gesture so casual, so dismissive, that it felt like a slap to everyone who had spent weeks seeking justice for Emily. She leaned back slightly in her chair, the chains between her wrists clinking softly, and mouthed a single word that the cameras caught in perfect clarity. "Whatever." It was the same word she'd use later, at sentencing, when consequences finally became real. But in this moment, it was pure defiance, the verbal equivalent of spitting on the grave of the girl she'd left in a creek. The prosecutor, and a woman in her 50s named Diane Reeves, who had built her career on holding people accountable, visibly stiffened at the defense table. Her hands, which had been resting calmly on a stack of files, curled into fists that she quickly forced to relax. Then something shifted in the room's energy, a change so subtle that most people didn't notice it at first. The camera angle, if this were the viral video that would later circulate across every social media platform, would have panned slowly to the left side of the courtroom, past the rows of spectators and family members, to land on a single figure sitting alone near the back. Lena Morgan, 15 years old, wore a plain cotton dress that hung loosely on her small frame, her hands trembling in her lap as she stared at the sister she used to share a bedroom with. Eyed the sister who had once taught her how to braid hair and sneak extra cookies from the cafeteria. Lena's eyes were red and swollen from hours of crying in bathroom stalls and empty hallways, and her face held an expression that was equal parts love and horror. The tension in that moment was so thick, it felt like the air itself had weight. On one side of the room sat a girl in chains who genuinely believed the system couldn't touch her, that her youth and cleverness would be enough to slip through the cracks of justice. On the other side sat a younger girl who had spent weeks wrestling with a choice that no teenager should ever have to make: protect the family member she loved or tell the truth about what she knew. When Prosecutor Reeves rose from her seat, the rustle of her suit jacket seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. She cleared her throat once, her eyes scanning the faces of the jury members who had already heard days of testimony, and then she spoke the words that would break Kayla's mask of confidence for the very first time. The state calls Lena Morgan to the stand. A murmur ran through the courtroom like a wave breaking against rocks, a collective intake of breath as people turned to look at the young girl in the back. Kayla's smirk froze on her face, her jaw clenching so tightly that the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. Her attorney, a public defender named Marcus Webb, who had been assigned to this impossible case, touched her arm in warning, but she jerked away from him, her eyes locked on her sister with an intensity that felt almost predatory. Lena stood slowly, her legs shaking badly enough that she had to steady herself against the bench in front of her, and began the long walk down the center aisle toward the witness stand. Every step echoed in the silent room, and with each one, the distance between the two sisters, both physical and emotional, seemed to stretch wider than any courtroom could measure. As Lena approached the front of the room, passing within feet of the defense table where her sister sat in chains, the camera would have captured something that countless viewers would later replay and analyze frame by frame. Kayla leaned forward slightly, her lips moving in a whisper that only Lena could hear. 2 words hissed with venom. Don't dare. But Lena didn't stop walking. She didn't look at Kayla. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead on the witness stand where a bailiff waited with a Bible in his hands, and in that moment of silent defiance, the entire case shifted on its axis. Judge Keene watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone who had presided over hundreds of trials and learned to read the language of guilt and conscience. She leaned forward slightly, her expression softening just a fraction as Lena reached the stand and turned to face the courtroom, her small frame dwarfed by the elevated wooden box. "Take your time, sweetheart," the judge said gently, and those 4 words held more compassion than Kayla had shown in the entire proceeding. Lena placed her right hand on the Bible, her left hand gripping the edge of the witness box so tightly her fingertips went white, and repeated the oath in a voice barely louder than a whisper. Behind her, projected on the courtroom screen for the jury to see, was a piece of evidence that had been recovered from Emily's water-damaged phone, a text message sent at 2 a.m, 3 days before the killing, from Kayla to a friend she thought she could trust. The words glowed on the screen in stark black text. "I swear, if Emily crosses me again, I'll make sure she never walks that hallway. Ever." The timestamp was there. The metadata was there. The intent was there, preserved in digital amber. Kayla shifted in her seat, the confident teenager who had laughed at the judge, suddenly looking very small beneath the carved wooden seal of the state of Ohio that hung above the bench like a promise. Her hands, which had been so casually dismissive moments before, and now gripped the edge of the table, and for just a fraction of a second, something like fear flickered across her face before the mask slammed back into place. But it was too late. The jury had seen it. The cameras had caught it. And most importantly, her sister had seen it, the girl who knew her better than anyone, who had shared a room and secrets and late-night conversations about dreams that now felt like they belonged to different people entirely. Justice, which had seemed like an abstract concept in the days leading up to this trial, suddenly had a face and a voice, and it belonged to a 15-year-old girl who loved her sister but loved the truth more. The story rewinds now, pulling away from the charged atmosphere of the courtroom and traveling back to a bright October morning in Riverside, Ohio, where the air smelled like fallen leaves and the promise of routine. This was a town where nothing dramatic ever happened, where the biggest news was usually which team won Friday night's football game or which student made the honor roll for the 5th consecutive semester. School buses lined up in neat rows beside maple trees that had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, and hand-painted banners celebrating academic achievements hung from the chain-link fences surrounding the athletic fields. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe letting their teenagers walk home alone, where front doors stayed unlocked during the day, and where tragedy felt like something that happened to other communities in news stories that scrolled across phone screens before being forgotten. Emily Santos walked across the Riverside High School courtyard that morning wearing her favorite faded denim jacket, the one with the small embroidered sunflower on the back pocket that her grandmother had sewn on as a birthday gift. Her backpack hung heavy on her shoulders, weighed down with advanced placement textbooks, calculus homework that was due next period, and sheets of violin music for the winter concert she'd been practicing for weeks. She moved through the crowd of students with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there, stopping to joke with friends about the impossibly difficult chemistry test everyone was dreading, offering to share her notes with a classmate who'd been out sick the previous week. Teachers who passed her in the hallway smiled automatically because Emily was the kind of student who made their job feel meaningful, the girl who stayed after class to ask thoughtful questions and help stack chairs without being asked. Her goals were specific and ambitious in the way that only a 16-year-old's dreams can be. She wanted to study biomedical engineering at a university her family could barely afford, driven by memories of watching her grandfather deteriorate from a condition that doctors had caught too late. "I'm going to fix what they missed," she'd told her mother more than once, with the fierce determination of someone who believed intelligence and hard work could overcome any obstacle. Her teachers wrote letters of recommendation describing her as exceptionally motivated and the student who lifts everyone around her, words that would later be read aloud in court while her mother wept into a tissue and Kayla stared at the ceiling with deliberate disinterest. But on this particular morning, Emily had no sense of the darkness gathering at the edges of her routine life, no warning that she had less than a week left to walk these familiar halls. At home, the Santos apartment was small but warm, filled with the kind of love that doesn't require money to flourish. Anna Santos came through the door at 7:30 that morning after working a double shift at the nursing home, her scrubs wrinkled and her feet aching from 16 hours of helping elderly residents who couldn't help themselves. She collapsed onto the worn couch with a groan that spoke of exhaustion deeper than sleep could fix, and before she could even remove her shoes, Emily appeared from the kitchen carrying a plate of reheated leftovers and a glass of water. "Did you eat at all today?" Emily asked, her voice holding that particular tone of gentle scolding that children use when they're forced to parent their parents. Anna smiled despite her fatigue, reaching up to touch her daughter's cheek, with a tenderness that made Emily's eyes soften in response. This was their routine, this dance of mutual care in a household where resources were tight, but affection was abundant. Anna worked impossible hours to keep them afloat after Emily's father had left when she was 7, disappearing into a life they knew nothing about and sending no support, no birthday cards, no acknowledgement that he'd left behind a daughter who still sometimes dreamed about him coming home. Emily had learned early to be self-sufficient, to cook simple meals and manage her own homework and walk herself to school. But she'd also learned something more important, that showing up for the people you love matters more than any amount of money or status. These were the details that would make Anna's victim impact statement so devastating months later. The small acts of kindness that proved Emily wasn't just a good student or a talented musician, but a genuinely good person who made the world measurably better by existing in it. That final week of her life, Emily was genuinely excited about an assignment in her English class. A group project about ethics and revenge in classical literature that her teacher had designed to make teenagers think critically about moral choices. She'd been randomly paired with Kayla Morgan, a girl she recognized from seeing in the hallways, but had never really spoken to beyond polite nods when they passed between classes. Emily texted a friend that night, her words preserved forever in phone records that detectives would later comb through for clues. Group project with Kayla tomorrow. She's intense, keeps making weird jokes about real revenge, but she's probably just edgy. I can work with anyone. That message, with its optimistic assumption that everyone was fundamentally reasonable if you just gave them a chance, would haunt investigators who read it after Emily's body was found. In stark contrast, the Morgan household existed just a few streets away, but might as well have been on a different planet. Their rental house had peeling paint that no landlord bothered to fix, a porch light that flickered constantly and cast strange shadows across the front steps, and an atmosphere of exhaustion that had nothing to do with hard work and everything to do with giving up. Rachel Morgan, Kayla and Lena's mother, also worked nights at a logistics warehouse, hauling boxes and scanning inventory until her back screamed in protest. But unlike Anna Santos, she came home to chaos instead of gratitude. The girls were left to fend for themselves most evenings, scrounging for dinner in a refrigerator that rarely held much beyond expired condiments and frozen meals. Doing homework at a kitchen table covered with unpaid bills and reminder notices about rent that was perpetually late. This environment wasn't an excuse for what Kayla would eventually do. The prosecutor would make that crystal clear during trial. But it was context, the soil in which resentment had been allowed to grow wild and unchecked. Rachel tried, in her limited capacity, to be present for her daughters, but she was drowning in the aftermath of a divorce that had left her with 2 children, no support, and a minimum wage job that barely covered rent. When she asked Kayla to watch her younger sister or help with household chores, the response was usually slammed doors and screamed accusations about being treated like a servant. The fractures in their family had started small, hairline cracks in the foundation. But by the time Emily Santos entered their orbit, those cracks had widened into chasms that no amount of love could bridge. Kayla had learned to see herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, and that self-perception had slowly poisoned every other aspect of her thinking. On the Thursday before everything fell apart, Emily sent another text to the same friend, this one slightly less optimistic than the first. Kayla's been saying some really weird stuff during our meetings. Made a joke about how people only respect you when they're scared of you. I tried to redirect to the assignment, but she just rolled her eyes. I think she might be going through something. Trying to be patient. That message, with its compassionate assumption that difficult behavior always stems from pain that deserves understanding, was the last record of Emily trying to see the best in someone who was already planning the worst. The apartment door closed softly behind her that final morning as she called back over her shoulder to her sleeping mother. "Don't wait up, Mom. I've got project stuff after school." Anna, half asleep on the couch, murmured something that might have been "love you," or might have been nothing at all, and then Emily was gone, walking toward a school day that would end in a way no one could have predicted, in woods that should have been safe, with a partner who should have been harmless. The camera shifts now to follow Kayla Morgan through those same school hallways, but the experience is completely different, filtered through a lens of isolation and barely contained rage. She moved through the corridors of Riverside High like a ghost that everyone could see, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. Earbuds wedged deep in her ears, playing music loud enough that she could pretend the world didn't exist. Dark eyeliner smudged around her eyes in a way that was either deliberately artistic or evidence that she'd stopped caring how she looked. Her black hoodie was pulled up most of the time despite the school's dress code policy against hoods indoors, the fabric creating a barrier between herself and a student body that had long ago decided she was weird, difficult, someone to avoid rather than befriend. When people stared at her, and they did stare, with that particular teenage cruelty that pretends not to be cruel, she would meet their eyes with a brittle half-smirk that dared them to say something while simultaneously warning them not to bother. The rumors about Kayla Morgan had accumulated over the years like sediment at the bottom of a polluted river, layers of truth and exaggeration that blended together until nobody knew which stories were real anymore. People said she used to be different in middle school, back when her parents were still together, and she lived in a better neighborhood on the north side of town. Teachers who'd had her in 7th grade remembered a bright student who turned in assignments early and volunteered answers in class. A girl who seemed destined for academic success before something fundamental broke inside her family structure. The breaking point was supposedly when her father left without warning or explanation, just walked out one Tuesday afternoon and never came back, leaving behind a wife who couldn't pay the mortgage and 2 daughters who learned that the adults in their lives could vanish without consequence whenever they decided family was too much work. After the eviction and the move to the rental house with the flickering porch light, Kayla's grades had plummeted from honor roll to barely passing. She'd started hanging around with seniors who had their own cars and their own supply of substances they probably shouldn't have been using, skipping 4th period to vape behind the gymnasium where security cameras didn't reach. Teachers noticed the change and made the usual attempts at intervention, concerned emails to her mother who never responded, offers of tutoring sessions that Kayla ignored, gentle questions about whether everything was okay at home that were met with shrugs and monosyllabic responses. Eventually, the staff gave up the way adults often do when a student makes it clear they don't want to be saved, redirecting their energy toward kids who seem more receptive to help. That abandonment, whether justified or not, had fed directly into Kayla's core belief that the world had decided she didn't matter. The warning signs were there for anyone trained to look for them, scattered through her schoolwork like breadcrumbs leading toward something dark. In English class, when students were assigned to write creative fiction, Kayla turned in stories that made her teacher uncomfortable enough to forward them to the school counselor. Narratives about characters who committed terrible acts of revenge against people who'd wronged them, and got away with it because they were smart enough to cover their tracks. When asked about the violent themes, Kayla had shrugged and said something about how fiction was supposed to be interesting, not boring moral lessons about good people winning. The counselor had noted in her file, "Student displays fixation on themes of retribution and appears to have difficulty distinguishing between justice and vengeance. Recommend monitoring." But monitoring never translated into meaningful intervention, just a file that would be discovered too late after Emily Santos was already gone. At home, the relationship between Kayla and her mother had deteriorated into a cycle of argument and avoidance that left both of them exhausted. Rachel would come home from her warehouse shifts and beg Kayla to help with basic household responsibilities. Watch your sister for a few hours, wash the dishes piling up in the sink. Please just try to be part of this family. Kayla's responses were always variations of the same theme. I'm not her mother. This isn't my mess. You're the one who decided to have kids you couldn't afford. The words were designed to wound, and they did, leaving Rachel to cry quietly in her bedroom while Lena sat at the kitchen table pretending not to hear. Those slammed doors rattled picture frames on walls, physical manifestations of rage that had nowhere constructive to go and so turned inward, a festering into something poisonous that would eventually need an outlet. Yet there were moments, rare and fleeting, when glimpses of the old Kayla would surface like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Lena would later testify about a night just 2 months before the murder when she'd been having nightmares, waking up crying about their father never coming back. And Kayla had climbed into her bed without saying a word and held her until she fell back asleep. She remembered Kayla teaching her how to ride a bike when she was 6, running alongside the wobbling bicycle and promising she wouldn't let go even though she eventually had to. These memories made Lena's eventual decision to testify against her sister so much more agonizing because they proved that the person capable of murder had once been capable of tenderness, that the transformation wasn't inevitable, but rather the result of choices made and empathy abandoned. The prosecution would never mention these moments of humanity, but they mattered deeply to understanding why justice felt less like victory and more like tragedy for everyone involved. Kayla's social media presence told its own story for anyone willing to piece together the fragments. Her accounts were filled with dark humor that crossed the line into genuine menace. Memes about revenge being a dish best served cold, TikTok videos lip-syncing to audio clips about never letting disrespect slide, Instagram stories with captions like, "Some people only understand one language, and that's fear," overlaid on images of storm clouds and abandoned buildings. Her followers were mostly people she didn't actually know, and strangers drawn to edgy content who had no idea they were watching someone's mental state deteriorate in real time. 3 weeks before Emily's death, she'd posted a quote that would later be entered into evidence. "The world teaches you that being nice gets you nowhere. Being feared gets you everything." 17 people had liked it. None of them had thought to report it. When the English teacher assigned partners for the ethics project, Kayla's reaction was captured by a classmate who happened to be recording a video at the wrong moment. The clip showed Kayla learning she'd been paired with Emily Santos, and her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, irritation, and then something that looked disturbingly like calculation. She'd turned to a friend standing nearby and whispered just loud enough for the phone's microphone to catch. "Of course they give me the golden girl. Let's see how perfect she feels when I'm done with her." The friend had laughed nervously, assuming it was just Kayla being dramatic the way she always was. Dark humor that didn't mean anything real. That video clip, recovered from the cloud after its creator realized what they'd witnessed, would be played in court while the jury watched Kayla's face for any sign of remorse that never appeared. The final detail that closes this chapter is visual and symbolic in equal measure. An empty classroom after school hours, the kind of space that feels haunted by all the learning and drama and boredom that fills it during the day. On the whiteboard at the front still displays the outline for the ethics project, written in blue dry erase marker. The ethics of revenge. When is justice justified? Can revenge ever be moral? Beneath those questions, someone has written the names of literary works to be discussed: The Count of Monte Cristo, Hamlet, Medea. But what the camera slowly pans toward, what makes this image linger in memory, is a single desk in the third row where Kayla Morgan sits every day. Carved into the wooden surface with what must have been a pen or key, scratched deep enough to be permanent, are 2 words that function as both confession and prophecy. No consequences. Those words would later be photographed by investigators and projected on courtroom screens. A reminder that Kayla's belief in her own invincibility wasn't formed in a moment, but cultivated over time, fed by a system that had failed to intervene until it was far too late to save anyone. The Wednesday that changed everything started like any other school day, with the usual chaos of backpacks slamming into lockers and conversations shouting over each other in hallways that smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage anxiety. Emily Santos had packed her lunch that morning, a sandwich and an apple, and tucked her project notes into a folder, labeled with careful handwriting that read, English, Revenge Ethics. She'd spent the previous evening organizing her thoughts about moral philosophy, typing up discussion questions she hoped would help guide the conversation with Kayla towards something productive and insightful. She had no way of knowing that those notes would later be recovered from her backpack by detectives wearing latex gloves, the pages water-damaged and mud-stained, each word a testament to how thoroughly she'd prepared for a meeting that would become her last. Kayla had arrived at school that morning in her usual black hoodie, but something about her energy felt different to the few people who paid attention to such things. She'd been quieter than normal during first period, staring out the window instead of doodling in the margins of her notebook, and when a teacher called on her to answer a question about the reading assignment, she'd responded with uncharacteristic politeness instead of her typical sarcasm. One classmate would later tell investigators that Kayla had seemed weirdly calm. Like she'd made some kind of decision about something, but at the time nobody thought much of it because teenagers were always having internal dramas that seemed earth-shattering to them and invisible to everyone else. She'd eaten lunch alone as usual, sitting at the far end of a table with her earbuds in, scrolling through her phone with an expression that could have been boredom or concentration or something else entirely. Around 3:15 that afternoon, as the final bell released students into the gray October day, Emily and Kayla met at the designated spot, the school library, a dated space with fluorescent lighting and rows of books that fewer students visited every year as everything migrated online. The security camera mounted above the entrance captured them arriving within minutes of each other, Emily in her denim jacket carrying her organized folder, Kayla with her hood pulled up despite being indoors and her hands shoved deep in her pockets. They moved toward the back of the library where study tables offered some privacy from the front desk, Emily leading the way with the confidence of someone who'd spent countless hours in this space, Kayla following a few steps behind like a shadow that had learned to walk on its own. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, remembered them choosing the corner table furthest from her desk, partially obscured by shelving units that held reference books nobody had touched in years. She'd glanced over a few times during the next 40 minutes, seeing the two girls bent over papers and occasionally hearing fragments of conversation that seemed normal enough. Emily's voice patient and explanatory. Kayla's responses brief and sometimes dismissive. At one point, Mrs. Chen had noticed Kayla gesturing animatedly, her arms cutting through the air in sharp movements, while Emily sat very still with her hands folded on the table, and she'd considered walking over to check if everything was okay before deciding that teenage drama wasn't her responsibility, as long as nobody was being physically threatened. That decision, that moment of choosing not to intervene, would haunt her for months afterward, even though there was no rational way she could have known what was coming. At 4:37 in the afternoon, the timestamp would become crucial later. The library's exterior security camera captured Emily and Kayla leaving through the side door together, visible for just a few seconds before they moved beyond the camera's range. Our Emily was talking, her hands gesturing in a way that suggested she was trying to explain something, while Kayla walked beside her with her hood still up and her face angled toward the ground. They headed east, away from the main parking lot where buses were still loading students, toward the edge of school property, where the paved walkway narrowed into a dirt path that most people avoided because it cut through a small stretch of woods before emerging near the residential streets. It was a shortcut that could save 10 minutes if you were in a hurry, and didn't mind the isolation, the kind of route that seemed perfectly safe in daylight, but took on different associations after dark. Emily had texted her mother at 4:42, a message that Ana Santos would read and reread 1,000 times in the months that followed, searching for some hidden meaning or warning sign that simply wasn't there. Running late, helping my partner finish up. I'll be home by dinner, promise. Ana had responded immediately with a heart emoji and the words, "Be safe, mija," a routine exchange that carried no weight at the time but would become unbearably heavy with hindsight. That text message, along with the dozens of others on Emily's phone, painted a picture of a girl who believed she was in control of her afternoon, who trusted that school projects were safe and classmates were predictable, and that the basic social contract that prevents people from hurting each other would hold firm just like it always had before. Around 5 o'clock, a piece of evidence emerged that nobody knew existed until weeks later when investigators were reviewing traffic camera footage from the surrounding area. A dash cam from a car stopped at an intersection 3 blocks from the school had captured a brief, blurry glimpse of 2 figures crossing the street toward the woods, one walking with purposeful strides, the other gesturing with increasing agitation, arms slicing through the air in movements that read as either emphasis or aggression depending on interpretation. The video quality was poor, the faces not clearly visible, but the timeline matched and the clothing matched, and later forensic analysts would confirm with reasonable certainty that the 2 figures were Emily Santos and Kayla Morgan. The driver of that car, an elderly man on his way home from a doctor's appointment, he had noticed nothing unusual, just 2 teenagers having what looked like an animated conversation, the kind of thing you see and forget within seconds because it seems utterly ordinary. As evening settled over Riverside, the sky turning that particular shade of gray that comes before rain, Ana Santos began to feel the first stirrings of worry. By 6:30, Emily should have been home. By 7, when dinner sat cold on the table and Emily's phone went straight to voicemail for the 3rd time, worry transformed into something sharper. Ana called 3 of Emily's closest friends, her voice carefully controlled as she asked if they'd seen her daughter after school, if they knew where the project meeting was supposed to be, if there was any chance Emily had mentioned going somewhere else. Each friend responded with variations of no and sorry and "That's weird," Emily always texts back, and with each call, Anna's composure cracked a little further. By 9 o'clock, she was dialing 911 with shaking hands, trying to explain to the dispatcher that her daughter was missing, that this wasn't like her, that something was terribly wrong, even though she couldn't articulate exactly what. Meanwhile, across town in a part of Riverside that Ana Santos had never visited, Kayla Morgan walked into a convenience store at 7:23 in the evening. The store's security camera captured her in grainy black and white, approaching the refrigerated section and selecting an energy drink with movements that seemed perfectly casual, perfectly normal. She paid in cash, and exchanging a few words with the cashier that he would later describe as nothing special, just regular customer stuff, and walked out into the drizzle that had started to fall. The footage showed her hoodie was damp, darkened by moisture in a way that could have been rain or could have been something else entirely. On her right sleeve, barely visible in the poor quality video, was a smear that everyone watching assumed was mud until laboratory analysis weeks later would prove it was blood. Emily's blood, transferred during those missing 47 minutes when both girls' phones had gone dark and the world had paid no attention whatsoever. The chapter closes on a police cruiser, pulling slowly through the darkened streets of residential Riverside, its headlights cutting through the rain that was falling harder now, turning dirt paths into streams of mud. 2 officers sat inside discussing the missing person report that had just come in, debating whether this was a runaway situation or something more serious, following protocol by checking the most obvious locations first. They drove past the high school, its parking lot empty except for a few staff vehicles, and then turned toward the wooded area where the shortcut path began. Officer Sarah Mitchell, who had been on the force for just under 2 years, climbed out with a heavy-duty flashlight and began walking the trail, calling Emily's name into the darkness while her partner radioed in their location. The beam of her flashlight swept back and forth across the wet ground, illuminating fallen leaves and exposed roots and scattered litter. And then it landed on something that made her voice catch in her throat. A backpack half buried in the undergrowth, its straps tangled around a broken branch, as though someone had dropped it while running or fighting or simply falling. She recognized the sunflower embroidered on the back pocket of the denim jacket still attached to the bag. And in that moment, everything changed from a missing person case to something far darker. Dawn broke cold and gray over Riverside, the kind of morning where the sun never quite manages to burn through the cloud cover and everything exists in a state of permanent twilight. The woods near the high school had been transformed overnight into an active crime scene. Yellow tape stretched between trees, creating boundaries that separated the ordinary world from the place where something terrible had happened. Officers and volunteer searchers moved through the underbrush in a loose formation, their breath visible in the cold air as they called Emily's name over and over, each repetition sounding more hopeless than the last. The overnight rain had turned the ground into a treacherous mix of mud and decomposing leaves that sucked at their boots with every step, and the smell of wet earth hung heavy enough to taste, mixed with something else that the more experienced officers recognized but didn't want to acknowledge yet. The K-9 unit arrived just after 6 in the morning, a German shepherd named Atlas who had been trained to track human scent even in difficult conditions. His handler, a veteran officer named Tom Briggs who'd worked with search dogs for 15 years, let Atlas sniff the backpack that had been carefully bagged as evidence, watching the dog's body language shift from casual interest to focused determination. Atlas pulled hard against his lead, nose to the ground, following an invisible trail that led deeper into the woods, away from the main path. The search team followed behind, branches catching at their jackets and radios crackling with periodic check-ins, each person silently hoping they'd find Emily alive, even as the growing delay made that possibility seem increasingly remote. The terrain sloped downward toward a drainage creek that ran through this section of woods, usually nothing more than a trickle, but swollen now from last night's rain, into a rushing stream of brown water carrying debris from upstream. A young officer named Marcus Chen, fresh out of the academy and working only his 3rd month on patrol, it was the first to spot something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. He'd been scanning the creek bank, looking for any sign of recent disturbance, when his eyes caught on an object wedged between exposed roots near the water's edge. A sneaker, white with a small hand-drawn star on the heel, done in blue permanent marker. His stomach dropped because he'd seen that same shoe in the missing person photos that had been circulated during the overnight briefing. Emily's distinctive way of personalizing her belongings, visible even now in this muddy context. He radioed his position with a voice that he managed to keep mostly steady, and within minutes the entire search team was converging on his location, moving with the kind of careful urgency that comes from knowing you're about to find something that will change multiple lives forever. So the creek made a small bend about 15 yards downstream from where the shoe had been found, and it was there that Officer Sarah Mitchell, wading carefully through the shallow water with her pants soaked to the knees, saw Emily Santos for the first time. She was lying face down in the creek bed, partially submerged in water that moved around her body like it was trying to carry her away, but couldn't quite manage the weight. Her hair spread out in a dark fan around her head, and one arm was extended forward, as though she'd tried to drag herself toward the bank before her strength had failed. The position suggested she'd been conscious at some point after ending up in the water, that she'd known what was happening and fought to survive. And that detail would later become one of the most devastating elements of the autopsy report. Mitchell stood frozen for several seconds, her training warring with the human response to seeing a child's body, before she managed to call out to her sergeant in a voice that broke halfway through the words. The crime scene technicians arrived within the hour, transforming the wooded creek bank into a carefully documented grid of evidence markers and camera angles. They worked methodically despite the cold and the difficult terrain, photographing every detail before anyone touched anything, capturing the position of the body and the surrounding area from dozens of perspectives that would later be assembled into a comprehensive picture of what had happened here. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Lawson, picked her way down the slope wearing waterproof coveralls, her expression professionally neutral as she knelt beside Emily's body and began the preliminary assessment that would guide the full autopsy. She noted lividity patterns that suggested Emily had been here since sometime yesterday evening, bruising around the face and neck that indicated a struggle, and a deep contusion at the back of the skull that appeared to be the result of blunt force trauma rather than an accidental fall. Additional evidence scattered the immediate area like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Emily's smartphone was found several feet from her body, its screen completely shattered and the back cover missing, lying in the mud as though it had been thrown or torn from her hand during a struggle. The waterproof case had protected it enough that technicians believed they might be able to recover data from the internal memory, a process that would take days but could potentially reveal crucial information about the final hours of Emily's life. Her project folder had partially disintegrated in the creek water, but individual pages were recovered downstream, stuck against rocks and tree roots, each one carefully collected and preserved despite their damaged condition. The notes about ethics and revenge and moral philosophy would later be read aloud in court, the irony of their subject matter lost on absolutely no one. Back at the Santos apartment, Anna had spent the entire night awake, sitting on the edge of the couch with her phone clutched in both hands, calling Emily's number every few minutes, even though it never rang. I just went straight to that electronic voice telling her the customer she was trying to reach was unavailable. When the knock came at her door just after 7 in the morning, 2 officers with expressions that communicated everything before they said a single word. The sound that came out of her throat was something beyond crying, a wail of grief so raw and primal that neighbors 3 doors down would later say it haunted them for weeks. She collapsed before the officers could catch her, her knees simply giving out as though her body had decided it could no longer support the weight of this reality. And the female officer knelt beside her on the floor, holding this stranger while she shattered into pieces that would never fit back together quite the same way. The news spread through Riverside with the speed that tragedy always travels in small towns, carried by text messages and social media posts and hushed phone calls between parents trying to figure out how to tell their own children that someone they knew was gone. Riverside High School activated its crisis response protocol, bringing in counselors and canceling classes, transforming the cafeteria into an impromptu memorial space where students gathered in crying clusters to process what felt incomprehensible. Emily's locker became a shrine within hours, covered with handwritten notes and flowers and photos, each edition representing someone trying to make sense of senselessness. The principal made an announcement over the intercom that managed to convey both grief and an attempt at reassurance, promising that counselors were available and that the school community would get through this together, even though privately he'd already been on the phone with the superintendent discussing security protocols and liability, and all the administrative concerns that accompany tragedy. Detectives, meanwhile, had begun the painstaking work of reconstructing Emily's final day, pulling surveillance footage from every camera within a mile radius of the school, interviewing anyone who might have seen her after classes ended. When they learned about the English project and discovered that Emily had been paired with Kayla Morgan, alarm bells started ringing for reasons that extended beyond simple coincidence. A quick background check revealed Kayla's history of disciplinary issues, her concerning written assignments, and the counselor's notes about monitoring her fixation on revenge themes. By noon, less than 6 hours after Emily's body had been discovered, detectives were already planning their first interview with Kayla, though they were careful not to telegraph their suspicions too obviously. The chapter closes on a detective named Raymond Foster, 20 years on the job and father of a daughter almost exactly Emily's age, standing in the woods, staring at the now empty creek bed where the body had been removed. In his gloved hand, he held an evidence bag containing a single page from Emily's project notes, the ink smeared but still legible, showing a quote she'd written in the margins. "Real justice means no one is above consequences." He read those words 3 times, his jaw tightening with each repetition, and made a silent promise to a girl who would never know he'd made it. That her death would have consequences, that the person responsible would be found and held accountable, that justice would speak for her even though she could no longer speak for herself. Within hours of Emily's body being discovered, the investigation machine began operating at full speed, pulling together fragments of information that would eventually form a picture of guilt so clear that denial became impossible. Detectives compiled attendance records, phone logs, and security footage from multiple locations, creating timelines that could be cross-referenced and verified. The fact that Emily's last scheduled school activity had been the English project meeting with Kayla Morgan emerged immediately as the most significant lead, a connection that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence when combined with everything else they were learning about the girl who'd been her partner. By early afternoon, Detective Foster and his partner, Detective Lisa Ramos, were walking through the hallways of Riverside High toward the principal's office where Kayla had been asked to wait, neither officer expecting the interview to go the way normal conversations with frightened teenagers usually proceeded. They found Kayla leaning against a locker in the main corridor rather than in the office where she'd been directed, seemingly in no hurry to comply with adult instructions even in circumstances this serious. She was spinning a pen between her fingers with practiced ease, her expression somewhere between bored and annoyed. As though being pulled out of class to talk to police about her dead project partner was an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. When Detective Ramez approached and introduced herself, Kayla's response was to glance up briefly, shrug one shoulder, and say, "Yeah, I figured you'd want to talk to me eventually. Everyone always blames the weird kid." That immediate defensiveness, that assumption of persecution before anyone had even suggested she was a suspect, struck both detectives as significant. Innocent people typically express shock and offer help, not preemptive complaints about being unfairly targeted. The interview room at the police station was deliberately neutral, designed to avoid the harsh interrogation atmosphere that people saw in crime dramas while still maintaining an environment where truth was expected. Kayla sat in a plastic chair with her arms crossed over her chest, one leg bouncing constantly in a rhythm that suggested either nervousness or impatience. The video recording system captured every moment of the conversation that followed, footage that would later be played in court while jurors watched Kayla's face for signs of the remorse that never quite appeared. Detective Foster started with the basics, establishing that Kayla had indeed been working on the English project with Emily and asking her to walk through the events of the previous afternoon in as much detail as possible. Her answers came in clipped sentences, each one offering the minimum amount of information necessary. "Yeah, we worked on the project. No, I don't know where she went after. I went home. Ask anyone." The inconsistencies began emerging almost immediately. Small contradictions that individually might mean nothing but collectively suggested someone trying to construct a story rather than remember actual events. Kayla claimed they'd stayed in the library until around 6 o'clock, working through the project requirements and barely speaking except about the assignment. But the security footage that Detective Ramez had already reviewed showed them leaving through the side door at 4:37, more than an hour earlier than Kayla was claiming. When confronted with this discrepancy, Kayla barely reacted, just shrugged, and said with deliberate casualness, "Time felt longer, I guess. Sorry I don't have a perfect memory of every single minute. We were doing boring schoolwork, not exactly memorable." That dismissive tone, the way she minimized the importance of accuracy when discussing the last known hours of a murdered girl's life, made Detective Foster's hands tighten briefly into fists beneath the table where the camera couldn't see. Further questioning revealed more gaps and contradictions that seemed designed to create distance between Kayla and Emily after they'd left the school grounds. Kayla insisted she'd walked straight home alone, cutting through the residential streets, rather than taking the wooded path, and had spent the rest of the evening in her room doing homework until she'd gone to the convenience store around 7:30. She claimed she hadn't texted with Emily after they'd separated, hadn't made plans to meet up later, hadn't had any disagreements or conflicts during their work session. While everything about her account was carefully constructed to present their interaction as brief, impersonal, and entirely forgettable. The kind of story that might be believable if investigators didn't already have evidence suggesting something far different had occurred. When asked directly if she had any idea what might have happened to Emily, Kayla's response was to roll her eyes slightly and say, "How would I know? Maybe she met up with someone else. Maybe she had problems nobody knew about. People aren't always what they seem." Between formal questions, Detective Ramez tried a different approach, speaking to Kayla less as a potential suspect and more as someone who might be struggling with complex emotions about a traumatic situation. She acknowledged that losing a classmate was difficult, that everyone processes grief differently, and that it was okay if Kayla was feeling confused or scared about what had happened. The response this gentler approach elicited was perhaps more revealing than anything Kayla had said under direct questioning. She leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, and said something that would later be quoted extensively in trial coverage. "I'm not scared, and I'm definitely not sad about some girl I barely knew. You want me to fake cry or something? Would that make this go faster?" The detectives exchanged a glance that conveyed volumes, both recognizing they were dealing with someone whose emotional responses operated on a frequency that didn't match normal human empathy. While Kayla was being interviewed, other officers were speaking with Emily's friends and classmates, assembling a picture of the relationship between the two girls that contradicted Kayla's characterization of them as near strangers who'd barely interacted. Multiple students reported overhearing an argument about a week before the murder, voices raised in the library during one of their project sessions. One witness, a junior named Marcus Webb, remembered Kayla saying something like, "You think you're better than everyone," while Emily had responded with visible frustration, "I just want to get a good grade. Can we please not do this?" Another classmate recalled seeing Kayla stare at Emily in the hallway with an intensity that felt uncomfortable, an expression of focused resentment that seemed disproportionate to whatever conflict might exist between two teenagers working on a group project together. These accounts are collected independently and consistent in their essential details, painted a picture of tension and hostility that made Kayla's claim of a forgettable, conflict-free interaction seem increasingly implausible. That evening, after Kayla had been released pending further investigation, there wasn't yet enough evidence to justify an arrest, just mounting suspicion that needed additional proof. A neighbor's doorbell camera captured something that would become important later. The timestamp showed 7:48, well after Kayla had returned home from the police station, and the video showed her stepping out onto the front porch and lighting a cigarette with hands that shook noticeably. She pulled out her phone and made a call, and though the audio quality was poor, forensic analysts would later enhance it enough to make out fragments of what she said. "They've got nothing, can't prove anything, just keep your mouth shut, and we're fine." The person on the other end of the call remained unknown, but the content alone suggested consciousness of guilt, an awareness that there was something to hide and proof to worry about, rather than the innocent confidence of someone who had nothing to do with a crime. Inside the Morgan house, visible through the front window to anyone who happened to be watching, Lena sat alone at the kitchen table with a stuffed animal from childhood clutched against her chest. She'd heard about Emily's death at school, processed it through tears and disbelief in the counselor's office, and come home to find police cars in front of her house and her sister being driven away for questioning. Now Kayla was back, talking on the phone in that low, urgent voice that Lena had learned meant serious trouble. And the younger girl felt the foundations of her world cracking beneath her feet. She wanted to believe her sister was innocent, wanted to trust that the police were wrong to suspect Kayla of something so horrible. But memories kept surfacing unbidden. Things Kayla had said in anger, jokes about revenge that maybe weren't jokes. That night she'd overheard her sister on the phone talking about making someone pay for disrespecting her. Lena wiped tears from her face with the worn fabric of the stuffed animal's ear and tried to convince herself that none of those memories meant what her gut was increasingly telling her they meant. The chapter closes on Detective Foster's desk at the station, now covered with file folders and printed photographs and handwritten notes mapping out the investigation's current status. In the center, he'd pinned 2 photographs side by side on a corkboard that would grow increasingly complex as evidence accumulated. Emily Santos in her school band uniform, smiling with her violin held proudly, and Kayla Morgan's most recent school photo, expression neutral and eyes staring directly at the camera with unsettling intensity. Between the 2 images, Foster had begun connecting pieces of information with red string in the classic detective fashion that seemed old-fashioned, but genuinely helped visualize relationships and timelines. A note card pinned beneath Kayla's photo held a single sentence in Foster's precise handwriting: "She's hiding something. Inconsistent timeline, no emotional response. Check phone records and search warrant." He stood back from the board, coffee cup in hand, studying the 2 faces and thinking about his own daughter safe at home doing homework, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with standing between victims and justice. Emily Santos deserved better than to be forgotten. She deserved someone to care enough to ask the difficult questions and follow the uncomfortable answers wherever they led. And Foster intended to be that person, even if it meant long hours and political pressure and dealing with a suspect who seemed to think charm and youth would insulate her from consequences. The investigation was just beginning, but the target was already clear. The police forensics laboratory occupied a windowless section of the county building's basement, a space filled with specialized equipment and technicians who understood that modern crime left digital fingerprints as revealing as the physical kind. Emily's water-damaged phone arrived in an evidence bag early Thursday morning, its shattered screen and missing back cover testament to violence that had occurred during her final moments. The lead technician, a woman named Sarah Park, who'd been recovering data from destroyed devices for almost a decade, replaced the phone in a controlled environment designed to slowly dry the internal components without causing further damage. The process couldn't be rushed. Moisture and electronics formed a destructive combination that required patience and precision to overcome. But Sarah understood that somewhere in this broken device might be the evidence that would explain exactly what had happened in those woods and why Emily Santos had never made it home. Over the next 72 hours, Sarah worked methodically through the recovery process, using specialized tools to bypass the damaged screen and extract data directly from the phone's memory chips. The device had been in the creek water for hours, and several components were permanently destroyed. But phones were designed with redundancy that meant information often survived even catastrophic damage. Bit by bit, fragments of Emily's digital life began reappearing on Sarah's monitor. Recent text conversations with her mother, group chats with friends discussing homework and weekend plans, dozens of mundane exchanges that painted a picture of a normal teenager living a normal life right up until the moment that normalcy ended. But it was a thread of messages with an unsaved number, labeled in the phone's contact list simply as K, that made Sarah immediately pick up the phone and call Detective Foster to tell him he needed to come down to the lab right away. The conversation thread between Emily and Kay stretched back almost 2 weeks, starting with practical exchanges about the English project, meeting times, division of work, reminders about deadlines. But the tone shifted noticeably about 5 days before Emily's death, becoming tenser and more confrontational in ways that suggested an underlying conflict that had nothing to do with Shakespeare or moral philosophy. 3 nights before the murder, Kay had written at 11:47 at night, "You really going to tell Ms. Turner about what I said in class?" Emily's response, sent after a delay that suggested she'd been weighing her words carefully, read, "I think you need help, Kayla. That essay about no consequences scared people. Maybe talking to the counselor would be good?" The reply had come back within seconds, all capital letters conveying fury, even through the limitations of text. "Mind your own business. Own. Not everyone needs saving." The messages became more explicitly threatening as the final meeting approached, escalating in a way that made Detective Foster's jaw tighten as he read through them on Sarah's computer screen. On the morning of the day Emily died, at 6:32 while most students were still getting ready for school, Kay had sent a message that would become central to the prosecution's case. "If you cross me, don't think the rules are going to save you. People like you only understand when something gets taken away." Emily had waited almost an hour before responding, and when she did, her words carried a dignity that made everyone who read them feel the weight of her loss more acutely. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm worried about you. But I also have to be safe. I'm going to talk to someone after our meeting today." That message, sent at 7:41 in the morning, was one of the last pieces of communication from Emily's phone before both devices went dark that afternoon. Detective Ramez arrived at the lab within minutes of Foster's call, and together they watched as Sarah pulled up additional data that contextualized the text messages within a broader pattern of surveillance and obsession. Kayla's phone number, once identified, allowed investigators to subpoena her complete records from the cellular provider, creating a map of her movements and communications that contradicted nearly everything she'd claimed during her initial interview. Cell tower ping data showed her device traveling the same path as Emily's between 4:30 and 5 o'clock that afternoon, moving from the school toward the woods rather than toward her house as she'd insisted. More significantly, both phones had gone completely offline, no calls, no texts, no data usage, for exactly 47 minutes, starting at 4:53, a window that aligned perfectly with the medical examiner's estimated time of death. When the devices came back online, Emily's phone pinged from the same location in the woods where her body would later be found, while Kayla's phone appeared 3 blocks away, moving steadily toward the residential area where the convenience store security footage had captured her buying that energy drink. The technical evidence continued to accumulate in ways that created an increasingly inescapable narrative of premeditation and guilt. Kayla's search history, recovered from her phone and laptop after a warrant was finally issued, revealed a disturbing pattern of research that suggested she'd been planning something for weeks before Emily's death. 2 weeks prior, she'd searched variations of phrases like, "How long does DNA last in water? Do security cameras record all the time?" and "Can police track phones when they're off?" 9 days before the murder, she'd looked up "What happens to kids who commit crimes as teenagers?" and spent 17 minutes reading an article about juvenile offenders being tried as adults. The prosecution would later argue that this research demonstrated clear premeditation, evidence that Kayla had been thinking through the practical implications of violence and weighing her chances of getting away with it, while the defense would attempt to characterize it as morbid curiosity common among teenagers fascinated by true crime content. When detectives brought Kayla back to the station for a second interview, this time with her mother and a court-appointed attorney present, they had printouts of the text messages and cell tower data spread across the table like cards in a game where the outcome was no longer in doubt. The attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Marcus Webb, who'd been assigned to the case, reviewed the evidence with visible concern while Kayla sat beside him with her arms crossed and that same smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Detective Foster walked through each piece of evidence methodically, pointing out the contradictions between Kayla's previous statements and the objective data that proved she'd been lying. The threatening texts, the overlapping phone locations, the suspicious internet searches. Each revelation should have prompted some kind of reaction, surprise, concern, even fear. But Kayla's response was to roll her eyes and say something that would be quoted extensively in later media coverage. "They're just words. Everyone jokes like that. You can't arrest me for being edgy." That phrase, being edgy, became a focal point of the psychological assessment that would eventually be ordered by the court. The consulting psychologist, Dr. Hannah Morrison, noted in her preliminary evaluation that Kayla displayed what she termed reactive narcissistic traits, a pattern of behavior characterized by an inflated sense of grievance, a tendency to see herself as the victim even when confronted with evidence of harm she'd caused others, and a notable absence of genuine remorse or empathy. In Kayla's worldview, as it emerged through multiple interviews and assessments, she was perpetually being wronged by a system that favored people like Emily, the good students, the rule followers, the ones who fit comfortably into societal expectations. The idea that her own choices and actions might have consequences that were justified rather than persecutory seemed genuinely foreign to her. A blind spot so profound that even when facing murder charges, she continued to frame herself as the real victim of unfair treatment. Rachel Morgan sat through that second interview with tears streaming down her face, one hand covering her mouth as though she could somehow prevent the horrible words being spoken from becoming real. She kept glancing at her daughter, searching for some sign of the child she'd raised, some indication that this was all a terrible misunderstanding that would be cleared up once the police realized their mistake. But the evidence kept mounting, each new piece fitting together with the others to create a picture that was becoming impossible to deny. When the detectives finally concluded the interview and informed them that they had enough evidence to seek an arrest warrant, Rachel's composure completely shattered. She grabbed Kayla's arm and said in a voice choked with desperation, "Tell them the truth. Please, baby, just tell them what really happened." Kayla pulled away from her mother's grip, her expression hardening into something cold and distant, and responded with 5 words that would echo through the trial to come. "They've got nothing. I'm untouchable." The chapter closes in the forensics lab late that night, Sarah Park having stayed hours past her scheduled shift to complete one final piece of analysis that she'd been working on all day. She'd discovered fragments of an audio file buried in a corrupted section of Emily's phone memory, pieces of a voice memo that Emily had apparently recorded on the day she died. The file was damaged, with sections missing and the audio quality poor. But Sarah had used specialized software to reconstruct as much as possible, and what she'd recovered was both heartbreaking and evidentially crucial. She called Detective Foster at home, knowing he'd want to hear this immediately, despite the late hour, and when he arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing sweatpants and an old college hoodie, she played the audio file for him without preamble. Emily's voice came through the speakers, hushed and anxious. "I'm recording this because Kayla's been saying some really scary stuff. If anything happens." There was ambient library noise, the scrape of chairs, and then Kayla's voice clearly audible in the background, her tone mocking and menacing in equal measure. "You really think tattling makes you safe? You're adorable." The recording cut off abruptly after that, but it was enough, more than enough. Foster stood in the lab, listening to a dead girl's voice preserving evidence of her own murder, and felt the familiar burn of anger that kept him doing this job year after year, despite the toll it took. Emily Santos had been smart enough, brave enough to know she was in danger and document it. Now it was his job to make sure that evidence meant something, that her final act of self-preservation translated into justice that would speak for her when she could no longer speak for herself. The recovered voice memo played a second time in the detective conference room on Friday morning, this time for an audience that included the district attorney, 2 assistant prosecutors, and the chief of police who'd taken a personal interest in a case that was rapidly becoming the most high-profile investigation Riverside had seen in decades. Emily's voice filled the room with its anxious whisper, each word carrying the weight of premonition that had proven tragically accurate. "I'm recording this because Kayla's been saying some really scary stuff. If anything happens..." The prosecutors sat motionless, absorbing not just the content, but the emotional impact of hearing a victim essentially testify from beyond the grave, providing evidence that would be nearly impossible for any defense attorney to explain away. When Kayla's mocking voice emerged from the background, "You really think tattling makes you safe? You're adorable?" The district attorney, a veteran prosecutor named Robert Chen, he closed his eyes briefly and made a decision that would shape everything that followed. This case would be tried as adult murder in the first degree, with every resource his office could marshal brought to bear on securing a conviction. The audio file was sent immediately to the State Forensic Audio Laboratory for authentication and enhancement, a process that would take several days but was necessary to ensure the evidence would be admissible in court. Experts analyzed the waveforms and background noise, confirmed that the file metadata matched the time and date stamps from Emily's phone records, and certified that no tampering or editing had occurred. They were also able to enhance certain portions of the recording, bringing up sounds that had been barely audible in the original. The scrape of a chair being pushed back aggressively, a sharp intake of breath that might have been fear, and at the very end, before the recording cut off, a sound that could have been a hand slapping down on a table or possibly making contact with flesh. Each detail added texture to the narrative investigators were constructing, transforming abstract data points into a visceral scene that jurors would eventually be able to imagine with uncomfortable clarity. While the audio evidence was being processed, the forensic team had been conducting detailed analysis of physical evidence that would prove equally damning. Kayla's black hoodie, seized after a search warrant had been executed on the Morgan residence, had been expedited to the State Crime Laboratory, where technicians examined every fiber and stain with painstaking attention. To the naked eye, the garment looked relatively clean, except for a faint brownish smear on the right sleeve that could have been mud, rust, or any number of innocuous substances. But under the specialized lighting used to detect biological materials, that smear began to glow with the characteristic fluorescence of blood that someone had attempted to wash away. The luminol test produced results that made the technician conducting the analysis immediately photograph everything before proceeding further, documenting the telltale blue-green luminescence that appeared along the sleeve and in scattered droplets across the front of the hoodie that had been invisible under normal light. DNA extraction from the blood evidence took 72 hours, a period during which Detective Foster barely slept, subsisting on coffee and takeout food while he coordinated other aspects of the investigation that were coming together with increasing momentum. When the results finally came back from the lab, they were exactly what he'd expected, but still felt like a punch to the gut. The blood on Kayla's hoodie was a genetic match to Emily Santos with a statistical certainty that exceeded 1 in several billion. There was no possibility of coincidental transfer, no innocent explanation that could account for the victim's blood being present on the suspect's clothing in multiple locations and in quantities that suggested direct contact during active bleeding. The defense would later try to suggest alternative scenarios. Perhaps Emily had a nosebleed during one of their library meetings. Perhaps they'd bumped into each other in a crowded hallway, but the pattern analysis told a different story, one of spatter consistent with impact rather than casual transfer. Additional physical evidence continued to emerge from the crime scene as technicians completed their methodical examination of every inch of the wooded area where Emily had been found. The missing back cover of Emily's phone, discovered wedged under a rock about 10 feet from where her body had been located, yielded a partial fingerprint that had been protected from the elements by the way it had landed. The print was fragmentary, showing only about 60% of the full pattern. But fingerprint analysis doesn't require complete prints to make positive identifications. Distinctive ridge patterns and minutia points create unique markers that can be matched with mathematical certainty. The forensic examiner who conducted the comparison worked through the night, photographing the recovered print from multiple angles and comparing it point by point against known prints from both Emily and Kayla. By morning, she'd identified 14 points of comparison that matched Kayla's right index finger, well above the threshold required for a courtroom testimony. When investigators presented this accumulating evidence to Kayla during her third and final interview before arrest, her demeanor underwent a subtle but significant shift. The bored, dismissive teenager who'd rolled her eyes at previous questioning was still present. But underneath the surface performance, cracks were beginning to show. Her leg bounced more frantically, her hands gripped the edge of the table with enough force that her knuckles went white. And when Detective Ramez walked through each piece of evidence methodically, the text, the voice memo, the blood, the fingerprint, the cell tower data, Kayla's breathing became noticeably faster. Her attorney tried multiple times to end the interview, recognizing that his client was close to saying something that would make his job even more impossible than it already was. But Kayla waved him off with angry gestures and leaned forward across the table with an expression that combined desperation and rage in equal measure. What she said next was captured on video from multiple angles, preserved for the jury that would eventually decide her fate, and quoted extensively in every media account of the trial. Her voice was tight with barely controlled fury as she spoke directly to Detective Foster, ignoring her attorney's hand on her arm, trying to pull her back. "Fine. Prove I pushed her. You can't. Maybe she slipped. Maybe she finally cracked from being so perfect all the time. Maybe she fell and hit her head and I panicked and ran. You don't know. You can't prove what I was thinking or what I meant to do." The statement was remarkable for several reasons. It was the first time Kayla had placed herself at the scene of Emily's death, the first acknowledgement that she'd been present when Emily ended up in that creek, and it revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of how the criminal justice system worked. She still believed that without a videotape of the actual act, without her explicit confession to intentional murder, she could create enough doubt to slip through the cracks. She didn't understand that juries were allowed to use common sense, to look at the totality of circumstances and draw reasonable conclusions about what must have happened. That same evening, Detective Ramez conducted an interview with Lena Morgan that had been postponed multiple times at the request of social services, who wanted to ensure the 15-year-old had appropriate support before being asked to provide potentially incriminating information about her sister. Lena sat in the interview room, a different one from where they'd questioned Kayla. I'd deliberately chosen to feel less threatening, with a victim advocate beside her and her hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate that had gone cold while she struggled to find words. When Ramez asked gently if Lena had overheard anything unusual in the days before Emily's death, the younger girl's face crumpled and tears began flowing freely down her cheeks. She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again, her entire body language communicating the agony of being forced to choose between protecting her sister and telling the truth about what she knew. The information that emerged from that interview, haltingly and through tears, provided crucial context that transformed the case from strong to overwhelming. Lena described overhearing a phone conversation the night before the murder, Kayla's voice carrying through the thin walls of their shared bedroom. "She's going to learn. I'm done letting people walk over me. If she wants to play snitch, I'll show her what consequences actually look like." At the time, Lena had assumed it was just her sister being dramatic, the kind of angry venting that teenagers did when they felt disrespected or challenged. She'd never imagined it was a genuine threat, never thought to tell anyone, because siblings kept each other's secrets and families protected their own. The guilt she felt now for not speaking up, for not warning someone that her sister might be dangerous, was crushing her from the inside, visible in every aspect of her body language, and audible in the way her voice kept breaking on certain words. With the audio evidence, the physical evidence, the digital evidence, our and now witness testimony all pointing in the same direction, District Attorney Chen made the formal decision to file charges. The arrest warrant was issued late Friday evening, and officers were dispatched to the Morgan residence at dawn on Saturday morning, arriving just as the sun was beginning to paint the sky in shades of gray and pink that seemed inappropriate for such a dark task. Lena watched from the upstairs hallway window as police cars pulled up with their lights off, trying not to wake the entire neighborhood as officers approached the front door with determined expressions. She heard the knock, heard her mother's confused and frightened voice asking what was happening, and then heard her sister's footsteps on the stairs, not running, not trying to escape, but moving with deliberate slowness, as though this were just another inconvenience in a life full of them. Kayla appeared at the front door in sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, her hair unbrushed and her face still puffy from sleep. And for just a moment she looked like what she was, a 17-year-old girl, still young enough to be considered a child by most measures. But then her expression shifted into that familiar smirk, that mask of defiant superiority that she wore like armor against a world she believed had always been against her. When the lead officer began reading her rights, "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Kayla interrupted him to say something that would be reported in every news article covering her arrest. "They can't touch me. I'm still a kid. This is all going to disappear." The officer finished reading the Miranda warning without acknowledging her comment, then placed handcuffs on her wrists with practiced efficiency. And Kayla's expression finally flickered with something that might have been fear or might have been rage, the mask slipping just long enough to reveal the frightened child underneath before slamming back into place. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing echoed through the early morning silence like a preliminary gavel, the first official sound of justice, beginning its slow, methodical process of holding someone accountable for a crime they believed they could commit without consequence. The juvenile detention center, where Kayla was held pending trial, existed in a strange, liminal space between prison and school, with cinder block walls painted in colors meant to be cheerful but only managing depressing, and staff who oscillated between correctional officer and counselor, depending on which approach seemed most likely to prevent violence. Kayla adapted to the environment with surprising ease, quickly figuring out the social hierarchies and unwritten rules that governed life inside, claiming a spot at a cafeteria table with other girls facing serious charges and presenting herself as someone who'd been wrongly accused by a system that had always been rigged against kids like her. She wore her orange jumpsuit like a costume she'd been forced into, constantly rolling her eyes at rules and procedures, maintaining that smirk whenever staff members tried to impose consequences for minor infractions. To the other residents, she told a carefully edited version of events that portrayed Emily as a snitch who'd gotten what she deserved, though she was always careful to stop short of explicit confession, aware even in this environment that words could travel beyond these walls. The court-ordered forensic psychological evaluation began 3 weeks after her arrest, conducted by Dr. Hannah Morrison, who'd spent 20 years assessing juvenile offenders and had long ago lost any illusions about teenagers being inherently innocent or redeemable. The evaluation room was small and windowless, furnished with 2 chairs and a table bolted to the floor, and Kayla entered for their first session with her usual defensive posture. Arms crossed, expression bored, one foot tapping an irregular rhythm against the linoleum. "Doctor." Morrison opened with standard rapport-building questions about Kayla's background, her family, her experiences growing up, and initially received the kind of monosyllabic responses designed to provide minimum information while maintaining maximum control. But Dr. Morrison was patient and experienced, and over multiple sessions spanning several weeks, she gradually created enough space for Kayla to reveal the thought patterns and belief systems that had led to Emily's death. What emerged from those sessions was a portrait of someone whose sense of victimhood had become so central to her identity that it functioned as justification for any action she chose to take. Kayla described her life as one long joke at my expense, a series of injustices beginning with her father's abandonment and continuing through poverty, social rejection, and what she perceived as systemic favoritism toward students like Emily, who followed rules and earned praise. In Kayla's narrative, she was perpetually being judged unfairly, held to standards that others weren't expected to meet, and punished for circumstances beyond her control, while privileged kids got endless second chances. The eviction from their home, the move to the bad neighborhood, her mother's perpetual exhaustion and inability to provide adequate attention. All of these became evidence not of common struggles that many families faced, but of a universe specifically designed to make her suffer while rewarding people who hadn't earned their advantages. Emily Santos occupied a particular space in this distorted worldview as the embodiment of everything Kayla resented about the world's unfairness. Dr. Morrison's notes from one session captured Kayla's description with chilling clarity. She was like this poster child for everything I was supposed to be but could never be because I didn't get the same chances. Perfect grades, teachers loved her, everybody thought she was so sweet and helpful. But she was a hypocrite. She'd smile at you and then report you to counselors, act all concerned when really she just wanted to feel superior. Nobody sees through people like that, except me. The psychologist noted that Kayla seemed genuinely unable to recognize that Emily's success came from effort and choices rather than unearned privilege, that the concern Emily had expressed about Kayla's troubling behavior might have been authentic rather than performative. This inability to accurately interpret others' motivations was central to how Kayla had ended up in detention facing murder charges. When Dr. Morrison asked directly about Emily's death during their 5th session, Kayla's response was telling in what it revealed about her capacity for self-deception and rationalization. She didn't admit guilt. Her attorney had been clear about not making explicit confessions, but she engaged in extensive hypothetical discussion that made her thought process transparent. If something happened, she said, leaning forward with intensity, it would only be because people push and push until finally someone pushes back. And then, suddenly, the person who finally stood up for themselves is the monster. That's not fair. When you're disrespected constantly, when someone threatens to ruin what little you have left, you have a right to defend yourself. That's justice, not murder. Dr. Morrison noted the way Kayla framed potential violence as self-defense against perceived disrespect, how she'd transformed Emily's stated intention to speak with a counselor into an existential threat that justified lethal response. The psychological testing revealed patterns that Dr. Morrison had seen before in adolescents who'd committed serious crimes, elevated scores on measures of callousness and low scores on empathy assessments, a tendency toward externalizing blame and minimizing personal responsibility, and a concerning ability to intellectualize harm in ways that prevented genuine emotional processing. When presented with hypothetical scenarios asking how she'd feel in various situations, Kayla's responses consistently centered her own experience while showing limited ability to genuinely imagine others' perspectives. Asked how she thought Emily's mother felt, Kayla shrugged and said, "I mean, it's sad, I guess. But she'll move on eventually. People always move on. No one cried for me when my whole life fell apart and my dad left. You just deal with it." The equivalency she drew between her father's abandonment and a mother losing a child to violence demonstrated the profound distortion in her emotional reasoning. Perhaps most disturbing to Dr. Morrison was Kayla's apparent belief that she'd done nothing genuinely wrong, that the problem was society's inability to understand justified responses to provocation. In one session, Kayla argued at length about double standards. "I pointing out that adults committed violence all the time, in wars, in self-defense, in protection of property, and were celebrated as heroes rather than condemned as criminals. If a soldier takes out someone who's a threat, they get medals," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "But when someone like me protects herself from someone who was going to destroy her life, suddenly it's murder? The rules are rigged, they're designed to keep certain people in power and punish anyone who fights back." Dr. Morrison noted that Kayla seemed unable to distinguish between proportional defensive force against genuine physical threats and premeditated violence against someone who'd simply expressed concern about troubling behavior. The evaluation also revealed Kayla's relationship with her sister Lena, which was complex and would become even more significant as trial approached. Kayla spoke about Lena with a mixture of affection and ownership, describing her as the only person who really gets me and the one person who's always been on my side. When Dr. Morrison gently pointed out that Lena had provided information to police, Kayla's expression hardened immediately, her jaw clenching as she said through gritted teeth, "She was manipulated. They scared her into saying things. She doesn't understand how the system works. When she's older and realizes what they did to her, to us, she'll know I was right all along." This conviction that Lena's testimony was coerced rather than conscience-driven revealed Kayla's inability to accept that even those who loved her might recognize her actions as wrong and choose truth over loyalty. During one of their final sessions before Dr. Morrison completed her report, she asked Kayla a direct question that cut through all the hypotheticals and rationalizations. "Do you feel bad for Emily's family?" The silence that followed was long enough to feel uncomfortable. Kayla staring at a spot on the wall while her expression cycled through several possibilities. Annoyance, calculation, something that might have been genuine consideration, before finally settling back into defensive dismissiveness. "I feel bad that they're sad," she said carefully, each word measured. "But bad things happen to everyone. Life isn't fair. They'll move on eventually because that's what people do. No one organized vigils or fundraisers when my family lost our house. No one cried when I lost everything. You grieve for a while, and then you deal with it, because wallowing doesn't change anything." Dr. Morrison noted that Kayla had managed to turn even this question into an opportunity to center her own victimhood, that her expressed sympathy was abstract and conditional rather than rooted in genuine empathy for suffering she'd caused. Meanwhile, visits from family members provided another window into Kayla's emotional landscape and her attempts to maintain control over the narrative. Rachel Morgan came weekly, each visit leaving her more drained and confused, caught between maternal instinct to defend her daughter and growing recognition that the evidence against Kayla was overwhelming. She would plead through the plexiglass barrier that separated them, begging Kayla to tell her the truth, to help her understand what had happened. And Kayla's responses were masterful exercises in manipulation, tears that appeared on command, protestations of innocence mixed with suggestions that maybe she couldn't remember everything clearly, constant reminders that, "You're supposed to believe me, you're my mother." Rachel left these visits emotionally devastated, while Kayla would return to her cell, showing no signs of the distress she'd displayed minutes earlier, her mask back in place as though nothing significant had occurred. Lena's visits were different, charged with attention that facility staff learned to watch carefully in case intervention became necessary. The two sisters would sit across from each other in silence for long stretches, Kayla staring with an intensity meant to intimidate, while Lena struggled not to cry. During one visit captured on security footage, Kayla leaned forward and said in a voice barely picked up by the microphones, "They want you to testify. Don't. Family doesn't snitch no matter what. You're mine. Remember, you're not one of them. You're mine." Lena had nodded then, her resolve appearing to crumble under the weight of her sister's expectations. But after she left the facility, she'd gone directly to the victim advocate assigned to their family and said through tears, "I can't lie for her anymore. I love her, but I can't pretend I don't know what she did." That moment marked the point where Lena began the painful process of choosing justice over family loyalty, a decision that would haunt her for years, but that she increasingly recognized as the only morally defensible choice available. The chapter closes on Dr. Morrison sitting in her office late one evening, reviewing her notes and drafting the psychological evaluation that would be submitted to the court and eventually influence sentencing recommendations. Her conclusion was careful but clear. Kayla Morgan presented with significant narcissistic traits, demonstrated profound deficits in empathy and remorse, and showed no evidence of genuine rehabilitation potential in her current psychological state. The report noted that while her difficult childhood circumstances provided context for understanding how these patterns developed, they in no way excused or justified the choices she'd made, and that public safety required extended incarceration combined with intensive therapeutic intervention. Dr. Morrison had assessed hundreds of juveniles over her career, and most showed at least some capacity for growth and change, some flicker of genuine remorse that could be cultivated into rehabilitation. But sitting in her quiet office, reviewing the case file spread across her desk, transcripts of Kayla's statements, photographs of Emily's memorial, notes about Lena's tears, she found herself writing a sentence she'd included in evaluations only a handful of times before. "If the jury hears even a portion of what this defendant has expressed during evaluation, there should be no doubt about the danger she continues to pose to others. Her belief in her own victimhood is so profound that it functions as permission for any action she deems necessary to protect her ego from perceived threats." The morning trial began. The Riverside County Courthouse transformed into something resembling a media circus, here with satellite vans lining the street and reporters jockeying for position on the steps where they'd deliver their live updates to audiences across the state. Inside, the courtroom filled hours before proceedings were scheduled to start, every available seat claimed by people who had arrived before dawn to witness what local news had been calling the trial of the decade, despite the decade being less than halfway through. Emily's classmates occupied 2 full rows, many wearing purple ribbons in her honor, while true crime enthusiasts who'd followed the case online sat beside journalists with laptops ready and sketch artists preparing to capture moments that cameras weren't allowed to record. The atmosphere felt electric with anticipation. That particular tension that comes from knowing something significant is about to unfold and wanting to bear witness to justice, either succeeding or failing. Kayla entered through a side door flanked by 2 bailiffs, and the room's energy shifted immediately, all attention focusing on the 17-year-old who looked simultaneously younger and older than her age suggested. Her public defender had arranged for her to wear civilian clothes rather than the detention center jumpsuit, a strategy meant to humanize her for the jury. And she'd been dressed in a modest navy blazer over a white shirt, an outfit clearly chosen to project youth and vulnerability. Her hair had been brushed smooth and pulled back from her face, and someone had convinced her to forego the heavy eyeliner that had become her signature look. For a moment, as she took her seat at the defense table, she almost looked like a frightened child, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. But then she turned slightly to scan the gallery, and that familiar smirk ghosted across her face as she made eye contact with someone in the overflow section, raising her eyebrows in a gesture that communicated disdain for the entire proceeding. Judge Marjorie Keene entered precisely at 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing as she took her elevated seat, and surveyed the packed courtroom with an expression that made it clear she would tolerate no disruptions. She'd presided over the Riverside County court system for 15 years, earning a reputation for fairness balanced with intolerance for games, and she'd been briefed extensively on Kayla's behavior during pretrial hearings. The eye-rolling, or the whispered comments, the general attitude of someone who believed rules applied to other people. Before jury selection even began, Judge Keene addressed the courtroom with words that carried unmistakable warning. "This is a court of law where serious matters will be decided with appropriate gravity. Anyone who cannot conduct themselves with respect for this process will be removed. That applies equally to spectators, attorneys, and defendants." Her eyes lingered on Kayla for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a message received and promptly ignored. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by District Attorney Robert Chen, who approached the jury box with the controlled passion of someone who'd been preparing for this moment since Emily's body had been discovered. He spoke for 37 minutes, walking the jury through the evidence they'd hear over the coming days, while weaving it into a narrative about a young woman whose entire future had been stolen by someone who believed consequences didn't apply to her. "This case is about a choice," Chen told the 12 jurors who would decide Kayla's fate, his voice clear and measured. "A deliberate, calculated choice made by the defendant to end Emily Santos's life because Emily had the courage to say that threatening behavior needed to be addressed. The defendant believed she could act without consequences. The evidence will prove otherwise. The evidence will prove that justice can speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves." Throughout Chen's opening, Kayla sat at the defense table exhibiting the kind of behavior that would ultimately damage her case far more than she understood. She whispered frequently to her attorney Marcus Webb, who kept putting a warning hand on her arm that she'd shake off with visible annoyance. She examined her fingernails with exaggerated attention when Chen described Emily's achievements and character as though bored by testimony about the victim's humanity. And when the prosecutor held up a photograph of Emily in her band uniform, smiling with her violin, Kayla's response was visible to everyone in the courtroom, a small, barely suppressed laugh that made several jurors visibly stiffen in their seats. Webb's face went pale as he leaned close to whisper urgently in his client's ear. But the damage was done. On that moment of inappropriate mirth captured in the collective memory of everyone who'd witnessed it. The defense's opening statement faced the impossible task of creating reasonable doubt in the face of overwhelming evidence. And Webb did his best, given the circumstances he'd been handed. He painted Kayla as a troubled, traumatized child whose life had been shaped by abandonment and poverty, arguing that what happened in those woods may have been a tragic accident born of teenage panic rather than premeditated murder. He emphasized Kayla's age, her difficult upbringing, the absence of any prior violent history, and suggested that the prosecution was asking the jury to convict based on text messages that represented typical teenage drama rather than genuine threats. "My client made terrible choices that afternoon," Webb acknowledged, knowing that complete denial would strain credibility. But making terrible choices in a moment of panic is not the same as first-degree murder. The prosecution wants you to see a calculating killer. I'm asking you to see a frightened child who made the worst mistake of her life and will pay for it regardless of your verdict. Kayla's visible reactions to her own defense attorney's strategy ranged from barely concealed irritation to outright dismissiveness, suggesting she disagreed with the approach of admitting any wrongdoing whatsoever. When Webb described her as traumatized, she rolled her eyes. When he characterized the events as potentially accidental, she shook her head slightly, as though correcting a teacher who'd gotten the facts wrong. And when he emphasized her youth and vulnerability, she sat up straighter with an expression that seemed to reject the entire premise of being portrayed as weak or damaged. The jurors noticed these reactions, exchanging glances that suggested they were forming opinions about the defendant that had nothing to do with the evidence and everything to do with the person they were watching reveal herself in real time. The first week of trial proceeded with the methodical presentation of the prosecution's case. Security footage, phone records, forensic analysis, each piece building on the others to create a structure that felt increasingly inescapable. When Emily's mother, Anna, took the stand to testify about the night her daughter went missing, describing pacing the apartment and checking her phone compulsively, and finally calling 911 when hope had given way to dread. The courtroom was so silent that the ventilation system became audible, a low hum underlying testimony that reduced several jurors to tears. Anna spoke directly to the jury, her voice breaking periodically, but her determination to be heard overriding her grief, and she described Emily's dreams and kindness and the particular way she'd had of making everyone around her feel valued. Throughout this testimony, Kayla sat at the defense table with her face turned slightly away, eyes focused on the clock above the judge's bench, visibly disconnected from the emotional weight of a mother's anguish. Judge Keene watched Kayla's demeanor with increasing attention as the trial progressed, making notes on a legal pad that would later inform her sentencing considerations. She'd seen defendants exhibit many different responses to trial: fear, remorse, defiance, desperation. But Kayla's particular brand of entitled dismissiveness was rarer and more troubling. When certain exhibits were shown, photographs of Emily's body in the creek, the shattered phone, the blood-stained hoodie, normal defendants showed at least some reaction, even if only the self-interested fear of being connected to evidence. But Kayla treated these moments as boring interruptions, occasionally stifling yawns, once asking her attorney loudly enough for nearby people to hear, "How much longer is this going to take?" That question, asked while a forensic technician was describing the process of extracting Emily's DNA from blood evidence, prompted Judge Keene to call a brief recess and summon both attorneys to her chambers for a conversation about courtroom decorum that was essentially directed at getting Kayla's behavior under control. The warned apparently had limited effect, because Kayla's conduct continued to undermine whatever sympathy her youth and difficult background might have otherwise generated. During Detective Foster's testimony about recovering the voice memo from Emily's phone, when the audio was played for the courtroom and Emily's frightened voice filled the space, Kayla shook her head and muttered something that the microphones didn't catch, but that caused her attorney to physically grip her arm in warning. When the prosecution presented Kayla's threatening text messages on the courtroom screen, enlarging them so every word was visible to the jury, she smirked and whispered to Webb, "Everyone talks like that. This is ridiculous." Several jurors had clear sight lines to the defense table, and their expressions suggested they were cataloging every inappropriate reaction, building a picture of the defendant that the evidence alone might not have created. The chapter closes at the end of a particularly difficult day of testimony, as Judge Keene dismissed the jury and spectators began filing out of the courtroom. Kayla stood when instructed, preparing to be escorted back to detention, and she turned slightly to look at the gallery one more time before leaving. Her eyes found Lena sitting in the back corner, and for several seconds the two sisters stared at each other across the crowded room. Kayla's expression was hard, challenging, a look that communicated both threat and betrayal, and while Lena's face showed nothing but exhausted sadness. Then bailiffs moved to escort Kayla out, and the moment broke, but everyone who'd witnessed that silent exchange understood that something significant had passed between them, a severing of whatever bonds had once held that family together, a recognition that they were now on opposite sides of a divide that could never be bridged. As the courtroom emptied and only the court staff remained, Judge Keene sat at her bench reviewing notes and preparing for the next day's proceedings, and she underlined a single observation she'd written during Kayla's latest display of inappropriate affect. Defendant shows no signs of remorse or even basic awareness that her behavior is damaging her case. Are either profoundly disconnected from reality or genuinely believes she will face no meaningful consequences. We'll be watching closely during sentencing phase. The prosecution had deliberately structured the trial to build toward a single devastating day when all the forensic evidence would be presented in sequence, creating an overwhelming accumulation of proof that would leave no room for reasonable doubt. That day arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks into trial, and the courtroom filled even earlier than usual with people who'd followed the case closely enough to know that today would be crucial. District Attorney Chen stood before the jury with a presentation remote in hand, ready to walk them through exhibits that would transform abstract accusations into concrete, irrefutable reality. The large screen mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life, and the first image that appeared was a screenshot of text messages between Emily and Kay, the threatening words enlarged enough to be read from anywhere in the room, each sentence a damning piece of the narrative Chen had been constructing since opening statements. The jurors leaned forward in their seats as Chen methodically walked through the text conversation thread, reading aloud in his measured courtroom voice the escalating threats that Kayla had sent in the days before Emily's death. "If you cross me, don't think the rules are gonna save you," he read, letting the words hang in the air before continuing. "People like you only understand when something gets taken away." The jurors followed along on the screen, some taking notes, others simply staring at the evidence with expressions that suggested they were internally calculating how anyone could read these words and not recognize them as threats. Chen paused before the final message, the one sent on the morning of Emily's death, and when he read it aloud, his voice carried additional weight. "You'll learn. I promise you'll learn." He let the silence stretch for several seconds before adding, "Emily Santos learned, members of the jury. She learned that someone's anger could be lethal. She learned it in those woods when the defendant made good on these threats." Several jurors glanced toward the defense table where Kayla sat with her arms crossed, and what they saw confirmed what the evidence was telling them. No remorse, no visible distress. Just that familiar expression of irritation, suggesting she considered this entire proceeding an inconvenience she was being forced to endure. One juror, a middle-aged woman who worked as an elementary school teacher, would later tell reporters that watching Kayla's reactions during evidence presentation was the moment she became certain of guilt, because anyone innocent would be horrified by the accumulation of proof rather than annoyed by its presentation. The contrast between the gravity of what was being shown and the defendant's casual dismissiveness created a disconnect so profound that it became its own form of evidence, revealing character in ways that testimony alone could never achieve. The recovered voice memo played next, and the courtroom audio system had been calibrated to ensure every word was audible even to spectators in the back rows. Emily's anxious whisper filled the space with heartbreaking clarity. "I'm recording this because Kayla's been saying some really scary stuff. If anything happens." The ambient library sounds in the background, the rustle of papers, the distant sound of someone coughing, made the recording feel immediate and real, not an abstract piece of evidence, but an actual moment from a real person's final hours. When Kayla's voice emerged, mocking and menacing, "You really think tattling makes you safe? You're adorable?" Several people in the gallery inhaled sharply, and Ana Santos covered her mouth with both hands as though trying to contain a sound of anguish. The recording ended with that abrupt cutoff that suggested Emily had realized she was in immediate danger, and the silence that followed in the courtroom felt heavy enough to have physical weight. Chen let that silence extend for a full 10 seconds before calling his next witness, a crime laboratory analyst named Dr. Patricia Wong, who'd conducted the blood evidence analysis. She approached the stand with the clinical confidence of someone who'd testified hundreds of times, carrying a folder of reports and prepared to translate complex forensic science into language that lay jurors could understand and trust. Using photographs and diagrams projected on the courtroom screen, Dr. Wong walked through the process of luminol testing that had revealed blood evidence invisible to the naked eye, and explaining how the chemical reaction with hemoglobin produced that characteristic blue-green glow that indicated someone had attempted to clean away biological material. The images of Kayla's hoodie under luminol lighting showed spatter patterns along the sleeve and scattered droplets across the front, a distribution that Dr. Wong explained was consistent with direct contact with an actively bleeding source rather than transfer from secondary contact. The DNA analysis testimony was particularly damaging because it eliminated any possibility of innocent explanation or coincidental transfer. Dr. Wong described the extraction process, the genetic markers that made every person's DNA unique, and the statistical analysis that compared the blood evidence against Emily Santos's known DNA profile. The probability that this blood came from anyone other than Emily Santos, Dr. Wong testified, her voice steady and authoritative, is less than 1 in 18 billion. Given that the current world population is approximately 8 billion people, we can say with scientific certainty that this is Emily Santos's blood on the defendant's clothing. She walked the jury through probability calculations and quality control procedures, answering every question in terms designed to eliminate doubt, and when the defense attorney tried during cross-examination to suggest contamination or error, she calmly explained the multiple verification steps that made such mistakes essentially impossible in modern forensic laboratories. The fingerprint evidence came next, are presented by forensic examiner James Rodriguez, who'd spent 32 years analyzing ridge patterns and minutia points. He displayed side-by-side comparisons of the partial print recovered from Emily's phone cover and Kayla's known right index fingerprint, using a laser pointer to highlight the 14 points of comparison he'd identified. For each point, he explained the specific ridge characteristic, bifurcation, ending ridge, island, dot, and showed how these patterns matched with mathematical precision between the two prints. Fingerprint identification doesn't require a complete print, Rodriguez explained to the jury with the patience of someone who'd educated countless laypeople about his specialty. We're looking for sufficient minutia points that match in sequence and spatial relationship. In this case, we have more than double the threshold typically required for positive identification. This is Kayla Morgan's fingerprint on Emily Santos's phone cover recovered from the crime scene. The defense attempted to create doubt by suggesting that Kayla might have touched Emily's phone during one of their library meetings, but Rodriguez was ready for this argument and demolished it efficiently. The location where this print was found matters, he testified, pulling up crime scene photographs. The back cover had been removed from the phone and was discovered approximately 10 feet from the victim's body, partially concealed under a rock. There's no innocent reason for the defendant's fingerprint to be on a piece of evidence that had been separated from the phone and hidden at a murder scene. The defense attorney tried several more approaches during cross-examination, but Rodriguez's expertise and the clarity of the evidence made creating doubt nearly impossible, and by the time he stepped down from the witness stand, several jurors were nodding slightly, as though mentally checking off another piece of a puzzle that was nearly complete. The cell phone tower data presentation was more technical but equally devastating, presented by a telecommunications expert who explained how phones constantly communicated with nearby towers, even when not actively in use. The analyst had created a map showing the routes both Emily's and Kayla's phones had traveled that afternoon, are two lines moving in parallel from the school toward the woods, converging at the location where Emily's body would later be found, and then diverging with only Kayla's phone moving away toward the residential area. Both devices went completely offline for 47 minutes, the analyst testified, pointing to the timeline displayed on screen. No calls, text, or data usage during this window. When they came back online, Emily Santos's phone remained stationary at the location where her body was discovered, while the defendant's phone appeared 3 blocks away, moving steadily away from the crime scene. This testimony directly contradicted Kayla's initial statement to police that she'd gone straight home. Another lie added to the growing pile of deception the prosecution was documenting. Throughout all of this methodical evidence presentation, Kayla's demeanor became increasingly agitated in subtle ways that suggested the reality of her situation was beginning to penetrate the armor of denial she'd constructed. Her leg bounced more frantically under the table, her hands gripped the arms of her chair with visible tension, and she leaned over to whisper urgently to her attorney with increasing frequency, despite his repeated warnings to remain silent and composed. At one point, when the blood evidence photographs were being displayed and Dr. Wong was explaining the pattern analysis, Kayla shook her head and muttered loudly enough for nearby jurors to hear, "This is such garbage." Judge Keene's gavel came down sharply, the sound cracking through the courtroom like a warning shot, and her voice carried steel when she said, "Ms. Morgan, you will maintain appropriate courtroom behavior or you will be removed. This is your only warning." The defense's cross-examination of each expert witness attempted to introduce doubt through technical questions about methodology and error rates, but the strength of the evidence made these efforts feel increasingly desperate rather than genuinely challenging. Attorney Webb did his best, questioning contamination possibilities, asking about alternative interpretations of evidence, trying to suggest that circumstantial proof shouldn't be weighted as heavily as direct observation. But circumstantial evidence, as the judge would later instruct the jury, can be just as powerful as direct evidence when multiple pieces point consistently toward the same conclusion. And that's exactly what Chen had built. Not a single devastating proof, but an interlocking structure where each piece supported and reinforced the others, creating something that felt impossible to dismantle or dismiss. The chapter closes with the prosecution resting its case after 2 full days of forensic evidence presentation, having walked the jury through texts, audio, blood, DNA, fingerprints, and cell tower data with methodical precision. Chen returned to his seat at the prosecution table with the satisfied expression of someone who'd done his job thoroughly and knew it. The defense would have their opportunity to present alternative theories and character witnesses, but the foundation had been laid, the wall had been built brick by brick, and everyone in that courtroom understood that reasonable doubt had been systematically eliminated. Judge Keene announced that proceedings would resume the following morning with the defense's case, then dismissed the jury for the day. As jurors filed out, several of them glanced back toward the defense table, where Kayla sat staring at the now blank projection screen, her expression for once showing something that might have been fear rather than defiance. She'd spent weeks treating the trial like theater she was being forced to attend, but the evidence day had finally made real what she'd been denying since her arrest, that consequences she'd believed couldn't touch her were closing in with the inevitability of mathematics and science and truth that couldn't be argued away, no matter how much she'd convinced herself otherwise. The night before Lena Morgan was scheduled to testify, she sat alone in the small apartment where social services had placed her after Kayla's arrest, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that made her bones ache. The foster family she'd been assigned to was kind but distant, treating her with the careful politeness people use around fragile things they're afraid of breaking. And she'd spent hours lying in an unfamiliar bed, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, trying to reconcile 2 irreconcilable truths. The sister she remembered braiding her hair and teaching her to ride a bike, the one who'd held her through nightmares and smuggled extra desserts from the cafeteria, felt like a different person from the defendant she'd been watching in court for weeks. But they were the same person. And Lena had to decide whether loyalty to memory mattered more than truth about present reality, whether protecting family was worth becoming complicit in the destruction of another family that had already lost everything that mattered to them. The victim advocate assigned to support Lena through the trial process, a gentlewoman named Maria Rodriguez, who'd spent 15 years helping families navigate the criminal justice system, had met with her a dozen times to prepare for testimony without ever pushing her toward any particular decision. Maria understood that Lena's choice to testify against her sister wasn't really a choice at all. The subpoena meant she had to appear and answer questions truthfully under oath. But the emotional weight of that obligation was crushing for a 15-year-old who'd already lost her father to abandonment, or her home to poverty, and now faced losing her sister to prison for crimes that couldn't be denied. During their final preparation session the previous afternoon, Lena had asked through tears, "Does telling the truth make me a bad sister?" Maria's response had been honest in the way that only someone outside the family system could manage. Telling the truth makes you a good person. Being a good sister would have meant Kayla not putting you in this position in the first place. The morning of Lena's testimony arrived gray and cold, with rain threatening from clouds that hung low enough to feel oppressive. She dressed in the plain blue dress that Maria had helped her select from a donation closet. Nothing too formal or too casual, something that would let the jury see her as an ordinary teenager rather than a performer playing a role. Her hands shook as she tried to button the front, and eventually Maria had to help, her capable fingers managing the task, while Lena stood trembling like she was facing execution rather than simply telling the truth about things she'd witnessed. The drive to the courthouse felt simultaneously too short and endless. Every traffic light a temporary reprieve and a delay of the inevitable. And when they finally pulled into the parking garage, Lena had to sit in the car for 5 full minutes, doing the breathing exercises Maria had taught her before she could make herself open the door and step out into the morning. Inside the courthouse, Lena waited in a witness room separate from the main gallery, a space designed to keep witnesses from hearing other testimony that might influence their own accounts. She sat on an uncomfortable chair with her hands folded in her lap, trying not to think about Kayla sitting just down the hall in the courtroom, probably talking to her attorney and definitely angry that her sister had been listed on the prosecution's witness roster. They hadn't spoken since a brief, terrible conversation 2 weeks earlier when Kayla had called from detention and said with quiet menace, "If you testify against me, we're not sisters anymore. You'll be dead to me. You understand? Dead." Lena had understood, had felt that threat land like a physical blow, but she'd also realized in that moment that the sister she'd loved was already gone, replaced by someone who'd rather destroy family bonds than accept responsibility for destroying Emily Santos. When the bailiff finally came to escort her to the courtroom, Lena's legs barely supported her weight, and Maria had to grip her elbow to steady her as they walked down the corridor toward doors that felt like they led to something irrevocable. The courtroom was packed as always, every seat filled with spectators who'd followed the trial obsessively and didn't want to miss the moment when the defendant's own sister took the stand against her. As Lena entered through the side door, the crowd's energy shifted palpably, a collective leaning forward as though everyone was holding their breath simultaneously. Her eyes found Kayla immediately at the defense table, and the look her sister gave her was pure hatred distilled into a single expression, promising retribution and judgment and permanent exile from the only family Lena had left in the world. But then Lena's eyes found Ana Santos sitting in the front row of the gallery, Emily's mother who'd lost the person she loved most, and somehow that gaze, full of grief and desperate hope that justice might mean something, steadied her enough to keep walking. The witness stand felt elevated and exposed, a chair positioned where everyone in the courtroom could watch every micro-expression and judgment that crossed her face. The bailiff approached with a Bible, and Lena placed her trembling hand on the worn leather cover while reciting the oath that bound her to truthfulness. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God." Her voice barely made it above a whisper, and Judge Keene leaned forward with an expression that was surprisingly gentle for someone whose job required such sternness. "Take your time, sweetheart," the judge said, and those 3 words of kindness nearly broke Lena's composure completely, tears springing to her eyes that she had to blink back rapidly before they could fall. She managed a small nod, and then District Attorney Chen was approaching the witness stand with the careful demeanor of someone handling something precious and fragile that needed to be preserved even while being used. Chen's questions started gently, establishing basic information about Lena's relationship with her sister, the living situation they'd shared, the family dynamics that had shaped their lives. Lena answered in a voice that gained strength gradually as the routine of question and response provided structure to hang on to, describing their childhood, their father's abandonment, on the financial struggles that had strained their mother and created an environment where resentment could flourish. But then the questions shifted to the specific time period before Emily's death, and Lena had to dig deep for courage to speak words that would help put her sister in prison. Chen asked if she'd overheard any conversations in the days before the murder, and after a pause long enough to feel significant, Lena nodded and began recounting the night she'd heard Kayla on the phone in their shared bedroom, her sister's voice carrying through the darkness in a way that suggested she either didn't care if Lena heard or had forgotten she wasn't alone. The words Lena testified to were devastating in their specificity and clear intent. "She's not going to ruin everything I have left. I'll make her pay. She'll see." Lena described lying in her bed pretending to be asleep while her sister paced and talked, the conversation one-sided but revealing enough that its meaning couldn't be mistaken for anything innocent. "I asked her the next day who she'd been talking about," Lena testified, her hands gripping the edge of the witness box so tightly her knuckles turned white. "She told me to mind my own business, but she was smiling in this way that scared me, like she'd made a decision about something and felt good about it." Chen asked how Kayla had seemed in the days leading up to Emily's death, and Lena's response painted a picture of someone increasingly focused and purposeful, rather than impulsively angry. She was calmer than usual, quiet, like she was thinking through something carefully instead of just reacting. Then came the most damaging piece of Lena's testimony, an exchange she'd almost convinced herself she'd misunderstood or misremembered until detectives had asked about it specifically, and she'd been forced to acknowledge what she'd heard. About a week before the murder, Kayla had been lying on her bed scrolling through her phone when she'd suddenly laughed and said out loud, as though continuing a conversation they'd been having, though they hadn't, "Do you think someone could push a person and make it look like they slipped? Cops are dumb. They'd never figure it out." At the time, Lena had responded with something dismissive, treating it like one of Kayla's dark jokes that she used to get reactions from people. But now, under oath and with Emily Santos dead from a head wound that could have come from either intentional violence or a fall, those words took on weight that felt crushing. "I thought she was kidding," Lena said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I thought she was just being edgy like always. I didn't know. I should have told someone." The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to undermine Lena's testimony by suggesting she'd been coached by prosecutors or manipulated by police, that her statements weren't reliable memories, but reconstructions influenced by knowing what had happened afterward. Attorney Webb approached with calculated gentleness, trying not to seem like he was attacking a grieving child while still doing his job of creating doubt. "Isn't it possible," he asked in a tone meant to sound reasonable, "that you're misremembering these conversations? That knowing what happened to Emily has made you reinterpret things your sister said in a more sinister light than they actually were?" But Lena, despite her youth and obvious distress, held firm under questioning, insisting that she remembered these specific moments clearly because they'd made her uncomfortable even before understanding their significance. "I know what I heard," she said with quiet conviction. "I wish I didn't, but I do." The most emotionally charged moment of Lena's testimony came when District Attorney Chen asked her, in redirect after the defense had finished cross-examination, how she felt about her sister now. The courtroom went utterly silent, on everyone waiting for an answer to a question that felt simultaneously too personal to ask and essential to understanding the human cost of Kayla's choices. Lena sat very still for several seconds, staring at her hands, and when she finally looked up, she didn't look at the prosecutor or the jury, but directly at Kayla, meeting her sister's hostile glare with an expression that held both love and devastating loss. "I love her," Lena said, her voice breaking on the words. "She's my sister, and part of me will always love the person she used to be. But what she did to Emily, and to Emily's family, and to all of us, it's not love, and if she doesn't get stopped, I'm scared of what she might do to someone else. Justice has to matter more than family sometimes. Or what's the point of anything?" That statement hung in the courtroom air like something physical, and several jurors visibly reacted to it, one older man nodding slowly, a younger woman wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Throughout Lena's entire testimony, Kayla had maintained a posture of aggressive indifference, occasionally whispering to her attorney or shaking her head in denial. But her facade had cracked progressively as her sister spoke. When Lena delivered that final statement about justice mattering more than family, Kayla leaned forward and hissed one word loudly enough for microphones to catch. "Liar." Judge Keene's gavel came down instantly, the crack echoing through the space like a gunshot, and her voice carried unmistakable warning when she addressed the defense table. "Ms. Morgan, you will remain silent or you will be removed from this courtroom. That is your final warning. Do you understand?" Kayla nodded stiffly, but her jaw remained clenched, and her eyes promised violence that her shackles prevented her from enacting. As Lena stepped down from the witness stand, released finally from the obligation that had been crushing her for weeks, she had to pass within a few feet of the defense table on her way to the exit. The two sisters' paths intersected in that narrow space between the witness box and the courtroom doors, and for a fraction of a second they were close enough to touch. Kayla leaned forward as far as her restraints allowed and mouthed a single word that lip readers in the gallery would later confirm. "Traitor." Lena flinched as though she'd been struck, her shoulders hunching protectively, but she didn't stop walking, and she didn't look away. She held her sister's gaze for one final second, and what passed between them was the complete severing of whatever bonds had survived poverty and dysfunction and parental abandonment. The final death of a relationship that couldn't survive one sister's choice to murder and the other sister's choice to tell the truth about it. Then Lena was through the doors, collapsing into Maria Rodriguez's arms in the hallway, while her entire body shook with sobs that had been held back for too long. And inside the courtroom, spectators sat in stunned silence processing what they'd just witnessed. A child forced to choose between family loyalty and moral responsibility, and choosing right even though it cost her everything. The trial's final phase moved with the momentum of inevitability. Our closing arguments delivered with passion from both sides, but everyone understanding that the outcome had been determined by the accumulated weight of evidence no amount of rhetoric could overcome. The defense had presented character witnesses who testified about Kayla's difficult childhood, a psychologist who discussed trauma responses and adolescent brain development, and Kayla's mother Rachel, who'd sobbed through testimony about being a single parent who'd failed to protect her daughter from circumstances that had shaped her into someone capable of terrible choices. But none of it changed the fundamental facts. Emily Santos was dead. Kayla Morgan had killed her, and the evidence proved premeditation rather than tragic accident. When both sides finally rested and the judge gave the jury their instructions about the law and standards of proof, The 12 men and women filed out of the courtroom to begin deliberations that most courtroom observers believed would be measured in hours rather than days. The waiting period that followed felt suspended outside normal time, the courthouse existing in a strange limbo where nothing could move forward until 12 strangers emerged from a locked room with a decision that would define the rest of multiple lives. Emily's family and friends occupied one section of the hallway outside the courtroom, sitting on uncomfortable benches or pacing in tight circles, speaking in hushed tones about everything except the verdict they were waiting for, because talking about hope felt too dangerous when disappointment might be coming. Kayla's mother, Rachel, sat alone on the opposite side of the corridor, isolated by the particular kind of grief that comes from loving someone who's done something unforgivable. Caught between the instinct to defend her child and the growing certainty that her child deserved whatever punishment was coming. The two families, both destroyed by the same act of violence from different angles, maintained careful distance, like magnetic poles that couldn't occupy the same space without repulsion. 4 hours after deliberations began, word came that the jury had reached a verdict, and the speed of their decision sent ripples of speculation through the assembled crowd. Quick verdicts typically meant clear guilt, evidence so overwhelming that extended discussion wasn't necessary. The courtroom filled rapidly with everyone who'd been waiting. The energy different now, charged with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Kayla was brought back in through the side door, and for the first time since trial began, she looked genuinely uncertain, the smirk that had been her armor replaced by something that might have been fear breaking through denial. She took her seat at the defense table and immediately began tapping her foot in a frantic rhythm that suggested anxiety her face wouldn't fully acknowledge, her hands gripping the edge of the table, hard enough that her knuckles went white. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, none of them looked toward the defense table, a detail that experienced trial watchers recognized as significant. Jurors who'd voted to convict typically avoided making eye contact with defendants, unable to face the person they'd just condemned. Judge Keene asked the standard questions confirming that a verdict had been reached and that it was unanimous. And then the foreperson, a middle-aged engineer who'd been elected to speak for the group, stood with a piece of paper that represented weeks of testimony distilled into a single conclusion. The judge instructed the defendant to stand, and Kayla rose slowly, her attorney's hand on her elbow, providing support she tried to shake off before apparently reconsidering and allowing. The room held collective breath, that particular silence that comes before moments that can't be taken back or undone. We, the jury, find the defendant Kayla Morgan guilty of murder in the first degree. The words hit like a physical force. To gasps breaking out across the gallery followed immediately by the sound of Ana Santos sobbing with relief that justice had arrived, even though it couldn't bring back what she'd lost. Several of Emily's friends embraced each other, tears flowing freely, while on the other side of the courtroom, Rachel Morgan's cry of anguish was different in tone but equally devastating. The sound of a mother watching her child's future disappear into a system that wouldn't release her until she was older than Rachel was now. The jury foreperson continued reading additional findings about aggravating factors and premeditation, but most people stopped hearing the specifics, focused instead on that primary verdict that meant accountability had been achieved and consequences were coming for someone who'd believed herself untouchable. Kayla's reaction to the guilty verdict was initially muted, her face going blank in a way that suggested she was processing information her brain had genuinely not prepared for, despite weeks of evidence pointing toward this exact outcome. She stood frozen for several seconds while chaos erupted around her, and then something broke through her shock, not remorse or acceptance, but fury. As Judge Keene thanked the jury and began explaining the timeline for sentencing proceedings, Kayla suddenly laughed, a short, incredulous bark of sound that cut through the courtroom noise like a knife. She shook her head in disbelief and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This is a joke? You're all insane if you think I'm spending my life for some accident." The courtroom erupted in fresh chaos, our people shouting responses while bailiffs moved toward the defense table, and Judge Keene's gavel came down repeatedly, the sharp cracks demanding order that took nearly a minute to restore. When silence finally returned, the judge's voice carried steel that made even the spectators straighten in their seats. "Ms. Morgan, you will control yourself. This is a court of law, and you will show respect for this process and this verdict." But Kayla, having apparently decided that masks no longer served any purpose, rolled her eyes in that familiar gesture of dismissal and muttered just loudly enough for the courtroom microphones to catch, "Whatever." It was the same word she'd used in the opening moments of trial, the same attitude of defiant superiority that had characterized her behavior throughout. And hearing it now after a guilty verdict made several jurors visibly shake their heads in something that looked like vindication for their decision. Judge Keene's expression hardened, the lines around her mouth deepening as she spoke with deliberate emphasis on every word. "There is nothing humorous about a young woman's life being taken, Ms. Morgan. Your attitude today speaks volumes, and I assure you it will be remembered at sentencing." Kayla started to respond, opening her mouth to say something that her attorney frantically tried to prevent by gripping her arm and whispering urgently. But she shook him off and addressed the judge directly with a boldness that was either courage or complete disconnection from reality. "You want me to pretend to be sorry? Would that make everyone feel better? She's dead, I get it. But you don't understand what she did, how she—" Attorney Webb managed to physically cover her mouth with his hand at that point, a desperate gesture that violated every norm of attorney-client relations, but that he clearly felt was necessary to prevent his client from confessing explicit guilt on the record immediately after conviction. Judge Keene ordered bailiffs to remove the defendant, and as they moved to escort Kayla out of the courtroom, she pulled away from them long enough to turn and face the gallery where cameras were still rolling despite rules against recording. What happened next would become one of the most replayed clips in the case's extensive media coverage, a moment that distilled Kayla's essential character into a single gesture. She looked directly at the cameras with that smirk fully restored, raised her chin in a gesture of defiance, and for just a second appeared to pose as though this were a photo opportunity rather than her removal from a murder trial where she'd just been convicted. That image, a teenage killer treating her guilty verdict like content for social media, performing for cameras while the victim's family wept just yards away, became the defining visual of the case, shared millions of times with captions expressing outrage at the apparent lack of remorse. Then bailiffs had her arms and were guiding her firmly toward the side door, and she went without further physical resistance, though everyone could hear her voice echoing from the hallway. "This isn't over. You can't do this to me. I'm not done." But she was done, at least in terms of the guilt phase of proceedings. Judge Keene regained control of her courtroom and addressed the remaining people with instructions about the upcoming sentencing phase, when both sides would have opportunity to present evidence about appropriate punishment, and the court would make final determinations about how the law should be applied to someone who'd committed murder as a juvenile. She scheduled the sentencing hearing for 3 weeks hence, allowing time for the probation department to complete a pre-sentence investigation report and for both legal teams to prepare their arguments. The date was set, the machinery of justice grinding forward with procedural inevitability, and then the judge dismissed everyone with a reminder that they'd been through something difficult but important, that the system had worked as designed, even though the outcome brought more grief than celebration to everyone involved. As the courtroom emptied, different groups processing the verdict in different ways, a cluster of reporters gathered outside to capture reactions for the evening news cycle that would dominate local coverage. Ana Santos, supported on either side by family members, made a brief statement through tears. "Nothing will bring Emily back, but knowing that the person who took her from us will be held accountable. It's not peace, but it's something. It's all we have." On the other side of the building, Rachel Morgan declined to make any statement, her face ravaged by crying, as she was escorted to a car by a social worker, having lost one daughter to death and another to prison in a span of weeks. And somewhere in the middle of these two poles of grief, Lena Morgan sat in the victim advocate's car in the parking garage, staring at nothing while Maria Rodriguez held her hand and promised her that she'd done the right thing, even though the right thing felt like it had destroyed everything Lena had left in her life. The chapter closes that evening in Detective Foster's office, where he sat alone after everyone else had gone home, staring at the investigation board that still held photos of Emily and Kayla connected by red strings and evidence markers. The guilty verdict should have felt like victory, and on some level it did. But mostly he felt exhausted by the weight of knowing that a 16-year-old was dead and a 17-year-old would spend decades in prison, and multiple families were shattered in ways that time wouldn't fully repair. He thought about his own daughter, safe at home doing homework, and about all the choices, large and small, conscious and unconscious, that separated her life trajectory from Kayla Morgan's. Then he began taking down the investigation board methodically, removing photos and documents and packing them into evidence boxes that would be stored until appeals were exhausted. And with each item he filed away, he felt the case transitioning from active investigation to history, from urgent present to tragic past, that would be studied and analyzed, but never changed. Justice had been served. Yeah, consequences had arrived for someone who'd believed herself above them, but there was no satisfaction in any of it, just the grim knowledge that the system had done what it could with a situation that never should have happened in the first place. The 3 weeks between verdict and sentencing passed with agonizing slowness for everyone connected to the case, each day feeling heavy with anticipation of the final chapter that would determine exactly what consequences looked like for a teenage killer. The courthouse atmosphere on sentencing day felt different from trial, quieter, more solemn, as though everyone understood they were gathering not to determine guilt, but to witness the formal translation of that guilt into years and decades and the irrevocable loss of freedom. The courtroom filled early again, but the energy was subdued rather than electric, people speaking in hushed tones that reflected the gravity of what was about to occur. Emily's family occupied their usual section, while Rachel Morgan sat alone on the opposite side, with Lena beside her for the first time since the trial began, the two remaining Morgan family members clinging to each other as the only anchors left in a world that had been completely transformed by Kayla's choices. Kayla entered through the side door, looking different than she had at trial, the borrowed blazer replaced by the standard orange detention center jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger and somehow more defiant simultaneously. She'd spent the weeks since conviction in isolation at the detention center after making threats against another resident, and the time alone had apparently done nothing to encourage reflection or remorse. She took her seat at the defense table with that familiar slouch, arms crossed over her chest, projecting an attitude that suggested she still believed this was something that was happening to her unfairly, rather than consequences she'd earned through deliberate choices. Her attorney Marcus Webb looked defeated before proceedings even began, having spent those 3 weeks trying unsuccessfully to get his client to understand that showing genuine remorse might impact sentencing, even though the guilty verdict was final. District Attorney Chen approached the podium to present the prosecution's sentencing recommendation, and his opening words established the framework for everything that would follow. Your Honor, this court is tasked with an extraordinarily difficult decision: how to sentence someone who committed an adult crime while still legally a child. The law recognizes that juveniles are different, that their brains are still developing, that they deserve consideration their age. But the law also recognizes that some crimes are so heinous, so premeditated, so utterly lacking in justification, that youth alone cannot be a shield against serious consequences. He walked through the evidence of premeditation, the threatening texts, the research about making deaths look accidental, the voice memo capturing Kayla's menacing words. and argued that this wasn't impulsive adolescent behavior, but calculated violence that would have been criminal, regardless of the perpetrator's age. Shichen's voice carried controlled passion as he detailed the aggravating factors that justified the harshest sentence available under law for a juvenile offender. The defendant showed no mercy to Emily Santos, who begged for her life in those woods. She showed no remorse afterward, instead lying to investigators and attempting to cover her tracks. She showed no respect for this court or these proceedings, laughing and smirking while the victim's family grieved. And even after conviction, she has demonstrated through her words and actions that she fundamentally does not accept responsibility for her choices. He requested life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years, the maximum sentence the court could impose given Kayla's age at the time of the offense, arguing that anything less would fail to reflect the severity of the crime and the danger she continued to pose to society. The defense's sentencing argument faced the impossible task of asking for mercy for someone who'd shown none, and Webb did his professional best despite knowing his client had sabotaged her own case through behavior that had alienated everyone who might have felt sympathy. He emphasized Kayla's age, just 17 at the time of the murder, a child by legal definition regardless of the adult nature of her crime. He walked through her traumatic upbringing, the father who'd abandoned her, the poverty that had stripped away stability and created an environment where healthy emotional development became nearly impossible. He presented letters from a psychologist arguing that the adolescent brain's lack of full development in regions controlling impulse and long-term thinking meant that teenage offenders deserved special consideration. Your Honor, Webb concluded, his voice carrying genuine emotion even if his client showed none. I'm not asking you to minimize what happened to Emily Santos. That tragedy will echo through generations. But I'm asking you to remember that Kayla Morgan is also someone's child, also someone who might change and grow and become different than the worst thing she's done. Don't throw away a life when there's still possibility for redemption. The victim impact statements began with Ana Santos, who approached the podium with a photograph of Emily clutched in her hands like a talisman against the pain she was about to articulate. Her statement was devastating in its simple honesty, describing the reality of losing a child in terms that transcended legal abstractions and made everyone in the courtroom confront the actual human cost of Kayla's choices. I wake up every morning reaching for my phone to text my daughter good morning, Ana said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. And then I remember she's in the ground. She's under the earth in a box, and I can't protect her anymore, can't hold her when she's scared, can't see her graduate or go to college or fall in love or become the doctor she wanted to be. You didn't just take her, Kayla. You took every tomorrow, every birthday, every Christmas, every moment I'll never have. You took my whole future and threw it away because your ego was hurt. Several of Emily's friends and teachers also delivered impact statements, each one adding texture to the portrait of what had been lost and why the crime deserved serious punishment. A classmate described Emily staying late to help her study for a test she'd been failing, patient and kind, even though she had her own work to complete. A teacher read from Emily's last essay, written days before her death, about the importance of standing up against injustice even when it's difficult or dangerous. Each statement reinforced the same theme, that Emily had been someone exceptional whose loss diminished everyone who'd known her, and that justice demanded accountability proportional to what had been taken. By the time the final impact statement concluded, several jurors who'd been present for sentencing were crying openly, and even Judge Keene had to pause to compose herself before calling for the next speaker. Rachel Morgan approached the podium with visible reluctance, her entire body language communicating the impossible position she occupied as both mother to the killer and someone who recognized the magnitude of what her daughter had done. Her statement was brief but searing in its honesty about her own failures and her desperate hope that even now something could be salvaged from the wreckage. I want to tell the Santos family that I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking repeatedly. I'm sorry I didn't see what was growing in my daughter. I'm sorry I was so exhausted from working and surviving that I missed the signs that she needed help. I didn't know how to give. I failed both my daughters. One of them is gone from this world, and the other is gone from me in a different way." She turned to look at Kayla, trying to make eye contact that her daughter refused by staring fixedly at the table. "I love you, baby, but what you did was wrong. I hope someday you can understand that and become someone different." Kayla's only response was a slight tightening of her jaw. No tears, no acknowledgement, just continued defiance in the face of even her mother's grief. Then came the moment everyone had been anticipating with a mixture of dread and hope. Lena's victim impact statement, the final chance for Kayla's sister to speak directly about how the crime and its aftermath had affected her life. Lena approached the podium looking impossibly small, wearing the same blue dress she'd worn to testify. Her hands shaking as she unfolded a piece of paper covered with handwriting that had been revised and rewritten dozens of times. She didn't look at her sister as she began speaking, addressing her words to Judge Keene as though Kayla weren't even present. "I thought I'd spend my life looking up to my big sister," Lena said, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "I thought she'd be at my graduation and my wedding and there for all the important moments. But now, every important moment for the rest of my life, I'll remember that she chose to take someone else's future and in the process destroyed our family too." Lena's statement built toward a conclusion that would be quoted extensively in media coverage, words that captured the essential moral question at the heart of the case. "I hope this sentence keeps other people safe. Even if it means I have to lose you. Justice has to matter more than family sometimes, or everything falls apart. What you did to Emily, to her mom, to all of us, it can't just disappear because you're my sister. If you don't face real consequences, what does that teach everyone else? That some people get to hurt others without accountability? That being young means you can take a life and walk away?" She finally turned to look at Kayla directly, tears flowing freely now. "I don't recognize the person you've chosen to be. I keep looking for my sister, and all I see is someone who thinks she's the victim in a story where she's actually the villain. Maybe 30 years will be enough time for you to figure out the difference." As Lena spoke those final words, something cracked in Kayla's carefully maintained armor. Her jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in her neck stood out like cords, her hands curled into fists on the table, and her eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously, refusing to let them fall where anyone could see. When Lena added quietly, "I love the sister I used to have, but I can't love what you've become," Kayla's face twisted with emotion that looked more like rage than remorse, and she opened her mouth as though to Judge Keene then asked the question that gave Kayla one final opportunity to demonstrate remorse or understanding that might influence sentencing. "Ms. Morgan, you have the right to make a statement before I impose sentence. Do you wish to speak?" The courtroom held its collective breath, everyone wondering if Kayla would finally show some sign of genuine remorse, some acknowledgement that she understood the magnitude of what she'd done. She stood slowly, her attorney whispering urgently in her ear right up until the moment she leaned toward the microphone. And what came out was perhaps more revealing than anything else she'd said or done throughout the entire process. "I'm sorry your daughter is dead," she said, her tone flat and carefully emotionless. "But this system was never going to listen to me anyway. You all decided who I was the second you saw me. The weird kid, the problem. Nobody cared what pushed me to that point or what she did that made me react. You just wanted someone to blame, and I was convenient." The statement was remarkable for its complete absence of genuine accountability, its framing of the murder as a reaction to provocation rather than a choice for which she bore full responsibility. Several people in the gallery gasped at the implication that Emily had somehow brought her own death upon herself, and Ana Santos let out a sound of pure anguish that cut through the courtroom like a knife. Judge Keene's expression hardened perceptibly, and she made a notation on the legal pad in front of her before gesturing that Kayla could sit down. The defendant had been given every opportunity to show remorse, or to demonstrate some understanding that would suggest rehabilitation potential. And instead, she'd used her final words to blame everyone else, the system, the victim, society at large, for consequences that flowed directly from her own deliberate choices. Whatever small possibility had existed that the judge might show leniency had been extinguished by Kayla's own words, and everyone in the courtroom understood that the sentence about to be imposed would reflect not just the crime's severity, but the defendant's utter lack of genuine remorse. Judge Keene sat in silence for several long moments after Kayla's statement concluded, her expression unreadable as she reviewed notes she'd been compiling throughout the sentencing hearing. The courtroom remained utterly still, everyone understanding that they were about to witness the formal pronouncement of consequences that would define the remainder of Kayla Morgan's life and determine whether Emily Santos's death would be answered with justice, proportional to what had been taken. The judge finally looked up from her papers, her gaze settling on Kayla with an intensity that made even the spectators feel the weight of judicial authority about to be exercised. When she began speaking, her voice carried the measured cadence of someone who'd thought carefully about every word and understood that this sentence would be scrutinized and analyzed for years to come by legal scholars, victims' advocates, and anyone interested in how the justice system handles juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes. "Ms. Morgan," Judge Keene began, her tone formal but not without humanity. "You were 17 years old when you took the life of Emily Santos, who was 16. The law recognizes your youth and requires this court to consider your age as a mitigating factor in sentencing. The Supreme Court has made clear that juveniles are different from adults, that their brains are still developing, that they are more susceptible to peer pressure and less able to fully consider long-term consequences of their actions, and that they retain greater capacity for change and rehabilitation than adult offenders. I have considered all of these factors carefully in determining an appropriate sentence." She paused, letting those words settle, before continuing with a shift in tone that made clear the direction her ruling would take. "However, the law also recognizes that youth is not an absolute shield against serious consequences, particularly when the crime demonstrates the kind of premeditation, cruelty, and complete absence of remorse that characterizes this case." The judge methodically walked through the evidence that had convinced her that the maximum available sentence was not only appropriate, but necessary to serve the interests of justice and public safety. She referenced the threatening text messages that demonstrated planning rather than impulsive action, the internet searches about making deaths appear accidental that showed consciousness of wrongdoing and desire to evade consequences, and the voice memo that captured Kayla's menacing words to Emily shortly before the murder. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment, Judge Keene stated firmly. This was a calculated decision to end another person's life because that person had the audacity to suggest that your concerning behavior should be addressed by appropriate authorities. You didn't kill in self-defense or in the heat of passion. You killed to protect your ego and to silence someone you perceived as a threat to your ability to operate without accountability. But perhaps more damning than the evidence of premeditation, Judge Keene continued, was Kayla's behavior throughout the legal process that followed the crime. "You have shown no genuine remorse at any point in these proceedings," the judge said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been disappointment or might have been anger carefully controlled. "You laughed in this courtroom when testimony described the victim's suffering. You mocked the process designed to hold you accountable. You rolled your eyes at your own victim impact statements, and even after conviction, even after your own sister courageously testified about the danger you pose, you continue to frame yourself as the victim and blame everyone else for the consequences of your deliberate choices." The judge paused, allowing the weight of this catalog of behaviors to register with everyone present. Your conduct has demonstrated that you lack the basic capacity for empathy and self-reflection that would be necessary prerequisites for rehabilitation. Judge Keene then addressed the specific question of appropriate sentence length, walking through the statutory framework that governed juvenile sentencing for first-degree murder. Ohio law, as modified by Supreme Court decisions, prohibited mandatory life without parole for juvenile offenders, but allowed substantial sentences with eventual parole eligibility for the most serious crimes. The question before this court, the judge explained, is how long you must serve before becoming eligible to ask, not to receive, but to ask, for release back into society. In making this determination, I must balance your youth and potential for change against the severity of your crime, the need to protect the public, and the requirement that sentences reflect the seriousness of the harm caused. She looked directly at Kayla, who had maintained her defensive posture throughout, but whose leg was now bouncing frantically in a tell that suggested her anxiety was breaking through the armor of defiance she'd worn for months. "The sentence of this court," Judge Keene pronounced, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "is that you are committed to the custody of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction for a term of life imprisonment with eligibility for parole after 30 years. A murmur ran through the gallery. 30 years was the maximum sentence allowed for a juvenile offender, reserved for the most serious cases where judges determined that lesser punishment would inadequately reflect the crime's severity. Anna Santos closed her eyes and nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face in what looked like exhausted relief rather than celebration. Rachel Morgan let out a choked sob and buried her face in Lena's shoulder, while Lena herself sat rigid and expressionless, staring straight ahead as though afraid that showing any emotion would cause her to shatter completely. The judge continued over the murmurs, adding mandatory conditions. "You will also be required to participate in intensive psychological treatment and rehabilitation programming throughout your incarceration, with regular assessments to determine if you develop the capacity for genuine remorse and empathy that you currently lack." Judge Keene wasn't finished, though the sentence had been pronounced. She leaned forward slightly, addressing Kayla directly with words meant to penetrate the denial that had characterized every aspect of her response to accountability. "You sat in this courtroom for weeks and heard overwhelming evidence of your guilt, Ms. Morgan. You heard your own threatening words played back. You saw your own blood evidence presented. You watched your own sister testify about the danger you pose. And through it all, you maintained that attitude of superiority and dismissal, that smirk that suggested you believed you were somehow above the consequences that govern everyone else in civilized society." The judge's voice hardened with each sentence, her patience with Kayla's defiance clearly exhausted. "Let me be absolutely clear. You are not special. You are not above the law. You are not entitled to harm others without facing serious repercussions. You will spend decades, likely the entirety of your young adulthood and middle age, facing the consequences you once claimed did not exist." Those final words, "consequences you once claimed did not exist," hung in the air like a verdict on Kayla's entire worldview, are a direct rebuttal to the no-consequences philosophy she'd carved into her school desk and lived by until Emily Santos's death had proven that philosophy catastrophically wrong. For the first time since trial began, Kayla's carefully maintained mask completely shattered. The smirk that had been her signature expression throughout proceedings disappeared entirely, her face going pale as the reality of 30 years penetrated in a way that nothing else had managed to reach. Her mouth opened slightly, her breathing became rapid and shallow, and she swallowed hard several times as though trying to prevent herself from being sick. 30 years. She was 17 now. She would be 47 years old before she could even ask for parole, nearly 50 before she might actually be released. Her entire youth, her entire young adulthood, all the experiences that defined growing up and becoming a fully formed person, gone, spent in institutional settings behind walls that wouldn't let her leave no matter how much she protested or rationalized or blamed others. The mathematical reality of the sentence seemed to hit Kayla in waves, each calculation bringing fresh horror to her expression. She'd miss her 20s entirely. She'd miss her 30s. She'd be closer to retirement age than to high school graduation by the time she might walk free. Everyone she knew would have lived entire lives, graduated, married, had children, built careers, experienced all the ordinary joys and sorrows that constituted a human existence, while she remained frozen at 17 in a prison cell with nothing but time to think about the choice that had brought her there. Judge Keene watched this realization dawn on Kayla's face with an expression that held no satisfaction, just weary recognition that this was how justice had to work when someone committed acts that couldn't be undone or minimized, when someone showed such profound disregard for both the law and basic human empathy that society had no choice but to remove them from circulation for the protection of everyone else. As bailiffs moved forward to escort Kayla out of the courtroom for the final time, she made one last attempt to maintain some shred of control over a situation that had completely escaped her ability to manage through charm or defiance or manipulation. She pulled away from the bailiff's grip and turned toward the gallery, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Lena. The two sisters locked eyes across the courtroom one final time, and whatever Kayla saw in her younger sister's face, not hatred, not triumph, just exhausted sadness and irreversible loss, seemed to break through the last of her defenses. Her eyes filled with tears that finally, after months of refusing to cry, spilled down her cheeks. Her lips moved as though she wanted to say something, needed to bridge the unbridgeable distance that now separated them. But no words came. She'd had countless opportunities to show genuine remorse, to take responsibility, to demonstrate that somewhere beneath the narcissism and resentment was a person capable of recognizing harm and changing course. She'd squandered every single one of those opportunities, and now it was too late for words to matter. Lena held her sister's gaze for a long moment, and then slowly, deliberately, she looked away, turning her attention to Ana Santos sitting in the row in front of her. It was a small gesture, but profound in its symbolism, choosing to direct her empathy and attention toward the grieving mother of the victim rather than toward the sister who'd caused that grief. Kayla flinched as though she'd been physically struck, and whatever composure she'd managed to maintain crumbled completely. She didn't resist as bailiffs firmly gripped her arms and began guiding her toward the side door that would take her from the courthouse to a transport vehicle and eventually to a prison where she'd spend the next several decades. As she passed through the doorway, she glanced back one final time, and the image that cameras captured in that moment would become the closing visual of countless documentaries and true crime videos. A teenage girl whose smirk had finally irrevocably disappeared, replaced by the dawning comprehension that arrogance and defiance were no match for consequences backed by the full weight of law and evidence and moral consensus. The courtroom remained quiet, even after Kayla had been removed, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed in their own way. Ana Santos sat surrounded by family and friends, accepting their embraces while continuing to cry tears that held both relief and ongoing grief. Justice had been served, but Emily was still gone, and no sentence could change that fundamental reality. Rachel Morgan had to be helped from the courtroom by victim services staff, her body racked with sobs for the daughter she'd lost to her own choices and the impossible position she now occupied of loving someone who'd done something unforgivable. Lena sat very still for a long time after everyone else had begun filing out, staring at the empty chair at the defense table where her sister had sat. And eventually, Maria Rodriguez had to gently touch her shoulder and guide her to her feet, reminding her that staying in this room wouldn't change anything, and that healing, if it was possible at all, would happen elsewhere over time, measured in years rather than moments. In the days and weeks that followed the sentencing, the case became the subject of extensive analysis and debate about juvenile justice, about how society should balance accountability with recognition of adolescent brain development. About whether 30 years was too harsh or not harsh enough for someone who'd committed premeditated murder at 17. Legal scholars wrote articles examining Judge Keene's reasoning and whether similar cases should be handled the same way. Victims' rights advocates pointed to the case as an example of justice functioning properly despite attempts by the defense to minimize responsibility through age-based arguments. Criminal justice reform advocates worried about the message being sent when teenagers received near-life sentences, regardless of rehabilitation potential. But for the people most directly affected, Ana Santos trying to build a life around the Emily-shaped hole in her heart. Lena Morgan trying to figure out who she was when she was no longer anyone's sister. A Rachel Morgan visiting a daughter in prison who still blamed everyone but herself. The case wasn't an academic exercise, but a permanent alteration of reality that would define every day that followed. The final image of this story isn't from the courtroom, but from a moment 6 months after sentencing, when Ana Santos visited Emily's grave on what would have been her 17th birthday. She brought the violin that Emily had loved, now silent and unplayed, and placed it against the headstone that bore her daughter's name, and the dates that encompassed a life ended far too soon. She spoke to the granite marker as though Emily could hear her, telling her about the trial and the conviction and the sentence that meant the person who'd taken her life would face consequences that matched the severity of the loss. Justice found its way. Mija, Ana whispered through tears. She thought there would be no consequences, that she could laugh her way past everything. But in the end, it wasn't just fingerprints or DNA that exposed the truth. It was her own sister choosing what was right over what was easy. Choosing you over her. That matters. That means something. The cemetery was quiet except for wind through trees, and Ana sat there for a long time, mourning all the birthdays that would never come, all the moments stolen by someone who'd believed herself untouchable until the moment that belief shattered against the reality that consequences exist for everyone, always, eventually, inevitably. And that justice, though slow and imperfect, finds its way to those who need it most, even when they can no longer speak for themselves.